The Vatican's hunt for Atlantis wasn't just folklore. It was, a deliberate journey through locked hallways, banned manuscripts, and riddles the Church never openly addressed. For generations, the Vatican pursued rumours of a drowned civilization, a realm some thought wasn't mythology, but Eden itself, concealed in forgotten charts and clandestine missions. This quest for Atlantis was genuine, and their discoveries might have transformed our understanding of everything. If mysteries woven with history and ancient enigmas captivate you, make sure to subscribe. So get comfortable, let your mind wander, and allow this tale to wash over you. Tonight, we tread carefully through history's darkest corners. It started not with dramatic fanfare or earth-shattering revelation, but with something subtle. A faint whisper, almost like wind slipping through cracks in ancient stone. The sound drifted quietly through the polished passages under St. Peter's Basilica, in depths where solitary walks were forbidden. Brother Luca had devoted nearly 4 decades to the Vatican Library. Fame eluded him. He held no cardinal's ring, no theological chair. He translated texts, preserved dying languages, spent his existence among stillness and endless rows vanishing into shadow. The quiet suited him. It allowed forgotten volumes to reveal their secrets. That particular evening felt unnaturally frigid. Rainfall drummed the towering windows, and candlelight wavered as though sensing an approaching presence. Luca was hunting for a displaced book about early ecclesiastical gatherings when his hand touched something unexpected. A slim volume bound in weathered crimson leather, unmarked along its edge. The interior pages carried Latin script, not mechanically produced, but inscribed by hand, in a manner suggesting far greater age than its shelf companions would indicate. Initially, he assumed it was a familiar religious manuscript. Then his eyes found a particular page. Midway through, a lone sentence occupied the margin in weakening ink, doubly underscored by an unsteady hand. They had knowledge of Atlantis. Luca's breathing momentarily ceased. That word belonged nowhere in this collection. Scripture never mentioned it. Christian teaching ignored it entirely. Atlantis lived in Hellenic legends, in Plato's philosophical writings, not among the Vatican's sanctified holdings. Yet there it sat, scratched in Latin, as if murmured by someone who dared believe differently. He glanced around, half anticipating a figure to materialize from the darkness, but solitude surrounded him. Only flickering flames bore witness. He carried the book to his workspace, pulse hammering beneath his vestments. Page by page he searched for additional clues, and discovered them. Toward the volume's conclusion, concealed under a sealed fold, lay a tiny sketch. No label identified it, but it depicted a circular metropolis embraced by ocean, with a cross positioned directly over the innermost ring. Luca recognized that configuration from a mosaic hidden beneath centuries of whitewash in the basilica's deepest vault. A design the tour guides never acknowledged. A design that seemed to summon him from below the very floor. He examined the page once more, and an unsettling realization took hold. Perhaps the Vatican hadn't suppressed the Atlantis legend because it was fiction, but because it was remembrance. From that instant forward, Luca understood that his beloved silence no longer felt hollow. That question reverberated through Brother Luca's consciousness like a distant bell, persistent and unavoidable. As he moved back into the dim passageway beyond the library, he sensed the emptiness thickening around him, the variety of quiet that feels denser than ordinary atmosphere, the kind that seems to have ears. Overhead, St. Peter's magnificent dome rose in hushed grandeur. Centuries had passed with it, serving as Christianity's nucleus, a testament to celestial power and mortal ingenuity. But Luca, walking solitary beneath its massive weight, started questioning if the dome fulfilled another function, to contain something. The Vatican embodied sacred magnificence, yet also concealment. Each corridor connected to another entrance, and each entrance could reveal history absent from accessible texts. Luca had always placed faith in the church's orderly tranquility, but now he found himself studying fractures in the stonework, contemplating what lay deeper. Sleep evaded him that night. Instead, he went back to the library at first light and submitted a request for restricted materials. Documents from Christianity's infant centuries, numerous composed when distinctions between devotion and philosophy remained undefined. The chance seemed slim, but he needed confirmation whether Atlantis had ever passed through Christian custody. 3 hours into his examination, he located something. A transcribed homily, probably from the 4th century, spoken by a bishop whose identity had been deliberately scratched away. The text had faded, yet one passage endured. Before the deluge, luminous cities existed. Their arrogance climbed skyward like monuments, and the ocean mercifully claimed them. Atlantis went unnamed, but the implication was unmistakable. The preacher wasn't cautioning against abstract wickedness. He was recounting a location, a society, something tangible. Why had this sermon survived? Why had the bishop's identity been obliterated? Luca transcribed the excerpt into his journal and tucked it within his robes. His life had been spent protecting words. Now he was pursuing them. As St. Peter's bells announced midday, Lucas positioned himself beneath the dome and gazed upward. It appeared transformed, less like an architectural crown and more like a seal. What additional secrets had been trapped beneath it? He rotated slowly toward the crypt entrance, recognizing he no longer functioned as a simple librarian. He was following a strand someone had attempted to sever generations ago. And just as he approached the initial descending step, a voice emerged from behind in hushed tones. That's not something you should pursue. The voice maintained composure, yet carried authority. Brother Luca pivoted gradually. Behind him stood Father Domenico, an imposing figure with colourless eyes and a quietness that frequently persisted after his speech concluded. His tenure in the Vatican library exceeded even Luca's. Most regarded him as merely a file manager. Yet Luca had always detected something more, something vigilant. "I was simply investigating ancient homilies," Luca replied, maintaining casual inflection despite his fingers gripping his robe tightly. Father Domenico studied him extensively, then advanced closer. Certain sermons were concealed deliberately. "Don't resurrect what the church put to rest." Then he departed. Luca remained alone beside the stairwell, heartbeat louder than the bells. He'd anticipated opposition, but not this rapidly, and not from library colleagues. Whatever truth resided beneath the Vatican had protectors. He proceeded to the lower reading chamber, a space so ancient its walls consisted more of bare rock than finishing plaster, and dust hung thick in the atmosphere. His objective had shifted from pursuing sermons or legends to understanding the original words that birthed the Atlantis narrative. The Critias and the Timaeus. Plato's dialogues had consistently been classified by the Church as pagan thought, yet Luca now pondered whether the Vatican had genuinely dismissed them. In the archive's distant corner, behind a shelf marked Apocrypha Greek, he discovered an unusual volume wrapped in waxed fabric. The catalogue contained no reference to it. The parchment within was fragile, the ink barely visible, yet the text was recognizable. Timaeus's opening passages, inscribed in Greek, accompanied by Latin rendering, and below them, annotations. Not academic commentary, but methodical, purposeful observations from someone attempting to correlate these ancient narratives with reality. One phrase bore circular marking, "The metropolis with stone and water rings consumed in 24 hours." Below it, another hand had inscribed in Latin, "The Church recognizes this isn't mythology. This is forewarning." Luca settled back in his seat. There it appeared again. Not legend, but recollection. Not fantasy, but proof. He cautiously advanced to the final page and encountered something unexpected. A small paper fragment, newer than surrounding materials, folded and attached to the inner cover. Upon it appeared a single sentence in Father Domenico's script. "Return this to where you discovered it." Luca closed the volume, but refrained from replacing it. Truth was ascending like floodwaters, and somewhere within the Vatican's depths, someone was observing. Brother Luca could sense it now. Not exactly terror, but a gradual constriction in the surrounding atmosphere. A perception that each forward motion brought him nearer to something preferring to remain untouched. Yet those hidden volume words resonated louder than cautions. The Church recognizes this isn't mythology. This is forewarning. He transported the book to his quarters that evening, enclosed in ordinary fabric and positioned carefully under his sleeping platform. That night, rest proved impossible. Images of metropolises encircled by ocean, temples collapsing into surf and fire descending from above played across his closed eyelids. Upon waking, the name Atlantis remained on his tongue. By dawn, he'd reached a determination. If the Church feared this narrative, the reason stemmed from the narrative touching something profound. And if the Vatican once accepted Atlantis as genuine, perhaps they perceived more than ruins. Perhaps they perceived judgment. The connection originated from Scripture, from the Great Deluge. That primordial moment shared across civilizations when the planet had drowned under divine wrath. Noah, the vessel, the few who endured. But Luca recalled something from his initial education, something that had troubled him even then. The Bible never claimed the flood submerged the entire globe. It referenced the world, humanity, the Earth's surface. What if that world possessed a name? In the lower library's tranquility, Luke located a collection of early theological interpretations. Dusty tomes composed when Christian intellectuals still grappled with Old Testament narratives. One by a 4th century bishop captured his attention. It maintained that the flood arrived not merely to purge wrongdoing, but to eliminate remembrance. The remembrance of metropolises that ascended too rapidly, that reached excessively high. No names were specified, yet one phrase kept recurring. The Western Stone Circles. Luca traced the passage with his fingertip. Stone circles. Concentric patterns. The identical configuration he'd witnessed in the concealed diagram. Atlantis as Plato characterized it. Then came a detail he hadn't seen previously. A footnote, scarcely readable, inscribed in minuscule writing along the parchment's margin. It stated, "Their pride exceeded Babel. Their descent was deeper than Eden's." He sat motionless. If Babel had provoked heaven's fury, what manner of location had fallen before that tower even existed? Suddenly, the flood became more than punishment. It was an act of elimination, of erasure. And for the first time, Luca grasped that the Church might not have feared Atlantis for its nature, but for its revelation about what preceded it. History wasn't only deeper than he'd imagined, it was darker. That same darkness pervaded the private writings of Pope Pius V. Though publicly remembered for confronting fascism and his austere theology, his personal diaries, rarely accessed, heavily guarded, told a different narrative, not of governance or doctrine, but of visions. One notation, composed in his precise handwriting on December 7, 1932, started simply, "Again. The illuminated metropolis beneath the ocean." I perceived it more distinctly this occasion. The Pope had documented similar visions previously. Once in 1927, repeated in 1930, always depicting a glowing metropolis under midnight blue waters. The structures were expansive, the pathways curved, and dominating everything, a temple of silver-white stone. He never identified the location, but consistently called it the remembrance that resurfaces during slumber. These weren't trivial dreams. They troubled him. The subsequent line in that identical notation stated, "Its towers radiate as if sanctified, yet I sense only foreboding." Brother Luca uncovered this diary accidentally, or perhaps it had been positioned for him. The volume had been incorrectly catalogued under pontifical correspondence, enclosed in gentle blue fabric, and identified solely with the letter P. The handwriting corresponded with other authenticated samples. Its authenticity was indisputable, and the depictions matched the exact diagram Luca had witnessed in the Forbidden Plato volume, a metropolis in circles embraced by ocean. Luca advanced through the pages deliberately, drawn deeper with each word. One passage dated during Lent proved especially disturbing. The voice in the vision declared it wasn't destroyed, merely concealed until the arrogant remember it once more. He leaned back, his pulse steady yet forceful. A pope had witnessed this location in visions, not once, but repeatedly, and not in celebration, in caution. That aspect lingered with Luca the longest. Why would the Catholic Church's leader receive visits from dreams of a metropolis never referenced in any catechism? Why would the voice communicate in puzzles about arrogance, remembrance, and resurgence? Then came something even stranger. In the diary's final section, compressed flat between two pages, rested a preserved flower, salt-marked, brittle, yet clearly maintained with intention. A brief note adjacent stated, collected from the coastline of the island they claimed never existed. No signature appeared, no geographic markers, just that quiet, impossible statement. Luca examined the faded petal and recalled the map, the one from the library compartment, the one bearing no identification. A pope had witnessed the metropolis in his visions, but someone else had already commenced searching. Brother Luca returned to the archive the following morning, earlier than customary. The passageways remained shadowed, the atmosphere moist with ancient stones scent. His footfalls barely resonated as he passed beneath arches carved generations ago. Today, he wasn't pursuing sermons or legends. He was seeking a map. The Vatican's cartographic vault held modest dimensions, yet significant age, and its compartments ran deep. Some hadn't been accessed in lifetimes. Luca proceeded methodically, compartment by compartment, each labelled with a region or expedition: Europa, Africa, Novus Orbis. Most contained expected materials, charts of recognised territories, sailing paths, papal expeditions. Yet near the chamber's rear, he found one completely unlabelled. The compartment resisted momentarily, then opened with a whisper. Inside, enclosed in linen and secured with wax, lay a solitary parchment. The wax seal had been previously broken. Unwrapping the fabric, he exposed a hand-drafted map unlike any he'd encountered. Delicate lines depicted Spain's coastline, Morocco's western boundary. Then something else. An island, substantial, circled with water, positioned solitary in the Atlantic centre. No name appeared, no nation, no reference markers. Yet inscribed just below the illustration in slender Latin script appeared 4 quiet words. Non terras sed ruinam. Not territory, but devastation. The phrase sent coldness across Luca's flesh. He traced his fingers along the paper, examining the marks. The illustration was meticulous, precise. Not an artist's fantasy, but a surveyor's documentation. Whoever created this map hadn't been conceptualizing a vanished world. They had witnessed it. He inverted it. On the reverse appeared a faded stamp, the papal insignia of Pius V, the identical pope who dreamed of submerged metropolises. Luca sat himself at the adjacent table, the map displayed before him, and absorbed the silence. Somewhere beyond these barriers, Rome was awakening. Yet down here, beneath the dome, time suspended its breath. Who had drafted this? When had it been deposited here? More critically, why was it concealed? As he leaned nearer, he noticed something additional. In the ringed island's centre, too minute to detect initially, appeared a shape, a symbol, a cross. The church had not merely known of this location, they had marked it as their domain. And as Luca examined the map once more, at the vacant ocean now filled with buried remembrance, a fresh thought formed quietly in his consciousness. What if Atlantis hadn't been eliminated by history, but maintained hidden, monitored and safeguarded? And if true, what were they safeguarding it from? Or what were they preventing us from discovering? That question persisted in Brother Luca's thoughts like incense adhering to his robe's fabric. It accompanied him through the hushed corridors, through the morning mass's stillness, even into his dreams. The Vatican had marked the vanished island. They had stored the map in an unnamed compartment, and they had enclosed it in linen, not for preservation, but for concealment. Yet the subsequent clue didn't originate from a map. It originated from a name. Father Matteo Orsini. The name surfaced in a footnote concealed within the Vatican's Jesuit travel documentation. Luca had only located it because he was examining expeditions launched during the early 17th century, particularly those to Atlantic islands. Most were standard missions, spiritual assistance to Portuguese colonists, reports from missionary stations, yet one notation stood distinct. In the year 1643, Father Orsini was dispatched from Rome to the Azores. The documentation listed no companions, no detailed objective. The journey's reason was identified with one word: observation. He never came back. No mention of death appeared, no illness, no shipwreck. Simply silence. Luca investigated deeper, cross-examining travel logs, Jesuit communications and vessel manifests. He discovered whispers, references to a discreet departure, to special directives, and once to a mission not to be identified. Yet the most definitive evidence came from a letter transmitted by a Portuguese priest stationed in Angra. The letter was never published, never officially received. It rested uncatalogued at the bottom of a container in the Vatican's secondary archive. Father Orsini arrived with no inquiries. It stated only a map. He discussed a metropolis that once existed where now the ocean covers. He requested silence. We granted it to him. More followed. A sketch, faintly rendered on the parchment's edge. A series of circles, identical to those Luca had witnessed in the forbidden text and on the unnamed map. And in the centre, a cross. Had Father Orsini discovered something? Had he reached the mystery's edge, gazed into the depths, and chosen not to return? Luca closed the letter and sensed the atmosphere transform again. The Vatican didn't simply conceal knowledge. It operated, it mobilized, it dispatched men, silent men, to known history's boundaries to protect what others must not discover. Yet what had Orsini witnessed? And more urgently, had someone else assumed his position? Because tucked into the identical file, folded into another page's margin, appeared a more recent name. A man who had also travelled west. A man still breathing. A Jesuit, still active, still seeking. Brother Luca held the folded paper in his shaking hands. The name inscribed there was Father Emilio Navarro. Unlike Orsini, Father Navarro wasn't a historical figure. He had been born in Argentina in 1971, had trained in theology, yet his published work was minimal. Apart from a single academic article on ancient religious symbols and a brief lecture in Lisbon, his record was strangely sparse. Yet his name surfaced in the same Vatican archive that had concealed Orsini's disappearance. That signified something. Navarro had been positioned in the Canary Islands, a quiet assignment distant from the church's political centre, yet proximate to the deep Atlantic waters where ancient accounts positioned Atlantis. Luca wondered how many others had traversed that same path, wearing black vestments and carrying questions nobody was meant to ask. A week elapsed before Luca could locate more. He utilized his senior privileges to request access to a restricted compartment in the Jesuit Records Hall. What he discovered stunned him. There, among routine correspondence and field observations, existed a small leather-bound diary with no listed author. Yet the handwriting corresponded with that of Navarro. The notations were brief, identified only by date and location. Most were unremarkable, depictions of terrain, weather, minor geological particulars. Yet one notation, dated August of 2006, stopped Luca frozen. Observed unusual stone configurations off the western shelf. 5 concentric layers, not natural, similar to Plato's description. Took sketches by lantern. Will communicate only to Rome. The accompanying illustration was almost identical to the ancient diagram Luca had located weeks before. A ringed metropolis, perfectly measured, with lines that radiated outward like wheel spokes. Navarro had inscribed no name on the page, yet in the corner, just below the spiral, appeared a small inked cross. That identical mark again. What disturbed Luca most was what came next. The subsequent page had been removed carefully, cleanly, as if by someone who understood exactly what they were eliminating. And the diary concluded there. Luca examined the image and envisioned Navarro on the cliffs above the Atlantic, sketching by wavering lantern light, the wind howling around him, waves crashing far below. Solitary with a truth nobody would accept. And a church that might never permit him to speak. Somewhere distant, Navarro had discovered something. Perhaps not Atlantis, yet something proximate enough to silence him. And ultimately, like Orsini before him, he too had vanished. Yet not without leaving evidence, because the illustration, though torn at the edge, had been duplicated, photographed and filed into a sealed compartment in the Apostolic Palace, where someone, not Luca, had left a note in faded pencil. Preserve the image, destroy the name. And Luca understood then that the Vatican's silence wasn't merely fear. It was safeguarding, or perhaps it was forewarning. Brother Luca now sensed the burden of every secured compartment, every sealed chamber, every truth fragment concealed beneath silence layers. The Vatican wasn't simply protecting faith, it was managing remembrance. And sometimes it appeared remembrance was treated like a danger. He directed his attention next to the Holy Office archives, where heresy cases had been documented for hundreds of years. Most were familiar cases involving teachings that diverged too drastically from doctrine. Mystics who claimed visions that disturbed the church. Yet Luca wasn't seeking what was familiar. He was seeking something forgotten. He started with documentation from the late 13th century, a period when the church had been especially vigilant with those who obscured the boundary between scripture and legend. And there, concealed under dust layers, he located an entry that hadn't been fully processed. The accused, Brother Silvanus of Amalfi. The charge, doctrinal error compounded by prophetic speech. The particulars were ambiguous initially, yet further examination revealed something startling. Silvanus, a monk recognized for his quiet discipline, had claimed to receive visions during nightly prayer. He depicted a radiant metropolis of gold and black, embraced by water, where men ascended as gods. He maintained this metropolis had once existed on earth, and that it had fallen not by accident, but by divine retribution. During interrogation, he reportedly whispered the name Atlantis. Luca sat motionless, the fragile pages trembling slightly in his grasp. This wasn't a pagan philosopher or an outsider. This was a monk within the church, charged not because he rejected doctrine, but because he remembered something too vividly. One passage from the trial transcript stood prominent. It stated, "He maintains the drowned metropolis was once in heaven's favour, yet its arrogance drew fire from above. He discusses it as if it persists still beneath the waves. He believes it awaits." The tribunal had silenced him, not with execution, yet with erasure. No subsequent mentions of Brother Silvanus appeared. His monastery documentation ceased within the year, and in the trial documents' margins a red stamp surfaced, one Luca had only witnessed once previously. Non confirmatur. Not confirmed. In other words, not disproven, just not permitted. Luca examined the final note, inscribed in a careful, elegant hand by the reviewing bishop. Should this tale ever resurface, it must do so as history, not faith. Let it be concealed. The church had not only hidden the remembrance of Atlantis, at least once it had concealed a man for daring to remember it. And that was when Luca comprehended. The deeper he ventured, the more perilous remembering became. Brother Luca started to sense it not only in his thoughts, but in the manner others observed him in the corridors. He noticed how discussions paused as he passed, how certain volumes he once accessed freely were now suddenly under examination. The Vatican didn't need to vocalize to demonstrate its concern. It simply closed entrances. Yet history, like water, always discovers a path through stone. It was during a quiet afternoon stroll in the Vatican gardens that Lucas stumbled on something nobody had discussed in years. An ancient Roman obelisk stood near the garden wall's edge, worn by centuries of rainfall and wind. Most tourists never witnessed it. It wasn't mentioned on the guided routes. Yet Luca had always been attracted to it. Something in its quiet existence, its forgotten age. He had passed it dozens of occasions, yet that day the illumination was different. The sun struck the stone precisely right, and he witnessed it. Something faint, half-carved near the foundation, almost concealed behind ivy. Letters, symbols, a configuration. He knelt and cleared the ivy aside. The carving had deteriorated, yet portions remained. Latin script, barely readable, Lux ex Occidente, illumination from the west, and below it a set of strange markings, numbers, unfamiliar at first observation, yet structured like coordinates. He transcribed them, heart accelerating, and rushed back to his study. After cross-examining with maritime charts and ancient maps, the location became evident. The numbers indicated a section of the Atlantic Ocean, west of the Gibraltar Strait, precisely where ancient sources maintained Atlantis had once existed. This was no coincidence. Someone generations ago had carved a direction into stone and left it standing in the church's gardens. And it had been disregarded, or concealed. Luca returned to the obelisk that night, just after the Compline bells. Solitary under a sky of quiet stars, he traced the symbols once more. He regarded the stone not as a relic, but as a communication. Had this monument once been a marker, a compass, a caution? Then something else captured his attention. Just below the foundation, nearly at ground level, existed a second carving, smaller, fainter. A circle. Within it, a cross. The symbol once more. That was 3 occasions now. 3 separate locations across 3 centuries. A cross inside a circle marked in secret texts, impressed into ancient maps, carved into stone, and always indicating west. Luca stood there for an extended time, the garden silent except for the distant rustle of wind through foliage. He was no longer simply reading history. He was walking inside it. Brother Luca understood that every step now pulled him deeper into something far more ancient than the Vatican itself. Whatever mystery surrounded Atlantis wasn't scattered or accidental. It possessed shape, order and protectors, and one name kept surfacing at the silence's edges: the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. More than any other organization within the church, the Jesuits had long been entrusted with knowledge preservation. even the kind not meant for sharing. They were scholars, explorers, confessors to monarchs, yet they were also record keepers, silent observers, and at their head a man whose title few outside the church comprehended. The superior general of the Jesuits, known in some quarters as the Black Pope, Luca requested access to their historical logs under the pretense of investigating missionary paths. Days of careful manoeuvring, coded discussion and patient waiting followed. Yet at last he was handed a ledger secured with wax. The year stamped across the cover was 1772. Inside, the handwriting was steady and official. The superior general at that time was Lorenzo Ricci, a man whose name had been nearly eliminated from official documentation after the Jesuits' suppression just a few years later, yet his words remained. An annotation from April that year immediately caught the eye. It detailed a mission, strictly classified, authorized directly from the general's office. The subject of the task was Thalassa, the sea. The record was sparse, yet significant. Clearance confirmed. Team assembled, location unspecified, objective, recovery, instruction, discretion, and beneath the text, the seal of the Black Pope, a stamp rarely seen outside the highest echelons of the order. Luca sensed the pace of time quickening around him. This was not a casual interest in folklore. The Jesuit leadership had sanctioned an oceanic expedition with no recorded destination and no subsequent documentation. That fact alone was unsettling. But the page that followed was what truly halted him. A piece of paper, folded, had been slipped between the leaves. On it, in faint dried ink, were the words, "Let Thalassa never be mentioned again." The price was too high. The light was extinguished for a reason. No signature, only the impression of the seal. Once more, Luca shut the book, his hands trembling slightly. The Jesuits had sought something. They had found it, and then they had ceased all discussion. Was it out of dread? Was it absolute obedience? Or was it because what they witnessed beneath the waves could not be described in any language spoken above the surface? Whatever the cause, Luca now grasped one certain truth. The quest for Atlantis was not an old wives' tale, a rumour or a passing fancy. It had been an official directive. Brother Luca could feel the weight of it, gathering pressure. This was no longer about forgotten tomes or erroneous charts. A genuine mission had been approved, executed, and silenced. And like everything hidden deep, it left behind an echo. He began examining the private Jesuit records with greater scrutiny. These were not stored in the principal Vatican library, but in a separate, more austere building situated just behind the Apostolic Palace. It was inaccessible to most academics. Even Luca required supervision and a sign-in. The clerk who provided the file was silent, his expression blank. The folder was simple, unmarked, save for a code. 13. 5. Inside, Luca discovered something unexpected. Not a formal statement, nor a diary entry, but a pledge. A ceremonial oath, written in Latin in a formal, scriptive hand. Its title was succinct, De Profundis Quint, of the fifth depth. The language was lyrical, yet disturbing. It spoke of shadow beneath illumination and remembrance beneath quietude. It made references to the submerged throne and the fractured temple below the rings. Most chilling was the promise itself. We swear to pursue the submerged light and speak of it to no living soul. We bind our voices to silence, our eyes to the abyss. May the fifth depth keep what heaven once retracted. There were 12 signatories, all of them Jesuits. None of their names appeared anywhere else in the records. Luca leaned back, taking a slow breath. The fifth depth. What did that signify? A metaphor, perhaps, or something literal. Layers below the ocean, layers below reality. He reread the phrase, "what heaven once retracted." It implied more than mere destruction. It suggested a deliberate removal. What if Atlantis was not simply lost? What if it had been sequestered? The idea was a faint flicker in Luca's mind, like a candle in a draught. And just as the notion formed, a line of smaller print at the document's base drew his attention. Location of covenant sealed in Vault Tridentis. The Vault of Trident. He had only heard it mentioned once, casually. A sealed chamber beneath the Vatican, predating many of the existing archives, reputedly established during the 16th century Council of Trent. Most insisted it had been emptied, but if this note was accurate, something remained within. He refolded the page and slipped it discreetly into his pocket. The church had interred Atlantis not just beneath the water or as a myth, but beneath layers of absolute quiet, secured by solemn vows, overseen by men who never spoke again. And now Luca understood another thing. The Vatican did not just conceal what it feared, it took an oath to forget it entirely. But Brother Luca could not let go. The words from the Jesuit pledge followed him like a faint whisper through the halls, always just below the sound of his own movement. The submerged light, the fifth depth, let it not re-emerge. That morning he began tracking the routes the Jesuits had once travelled. Not within Rome, but across the ocean. The Society of Jesus maintained outposts dotted across the Atlantic world. Luca focused on two places frequently noted in the archival travel reports, Madeira and Malta. Both were ancient harbours, and both had been used discreetly apart from major operations for observation. The same term used in Orsini's departure record. He started with Madeira, the westernmost frontier of the Old World, a group of islands off the African coastline. In the year 1864, a Jesuit priest stationed there documented an anomaly along the coast. The report was never made public, but a carbon copy had been placed inside an untitled, sealed folder. The priest wrote of peculiar tides and luminous water, of a deep resonance beneath the cliffs at night. More disturbing was his concluding remark. Fishermen claimed the sea was singing on Tuesday. I heard it myself. It was not the wind, it was not a storm. I did not sleep. Luca closed his eyes, attempting to visualize it. A priest in dark vestments, standing alone under the stars, listening to an ocean that whispered back from Madeira. The records then shifted eastward. Malta. There, a document from the early 20th century revealed a brief excavation on church-owned territory near the Dingley Cliffs. It was headed by a Jesuit archaeologist whose findings were never published. The file stated only, stone rings discovered, composition unknown, site covered, discussion terminated, rings again, always the same geometric shape, the same total silence. But the final detail was what most chilled Luca. In both reports, one from Madeira, one from Malta, a small hand-drawn symbol was marked in the page's corner, the identical cross enclosed within a circle. He had encountered it previously, on a map, on a piece of stone, on a sketch. Now it shadowed him across the sea. This was not chance. It was a route, a map. Someone had outlined the periphery of a sunken memory, inscribing its existence in rock and ink. But never in actual words, because to utter it was to wake it. And Luca, now following their path, understood something deeper than all the texts and vows. Atlantis had not been forgotten. It had been plotted, and it was waiting. Brother Luca returned to the archives, his heart heavy and his mind racing. The disparate elements were aligning, not with sudden force, but with the slow, deliberate weight of something long suppressed, resurfacing towards the light. Yet he still failed to comprehend the profound fear of the Church. What was the threat of Atlantis? Why safeguard its memory so intensely? That clarification came in the form of an unreleased essay. It had been composed by a Vatican scholar named Father Erhardt in the late 19th century. The document was marked internal use only, filed not with theology, but with philosophical and historical critiques. Titled Reflections on Babel, it analysed humanity's initial striving for divine stature, not solely through hubris, but through profound intellect. It was a challenging piece, filled with complex thought and cautious phrasing, but one concept stood out. Father Erhard proposed the Tower of Babel was not merely a symbol of human arrogance, but a caution against an archaic uniformity, a period when mankind shared a single language, not only of speech, but of objective. He wrote, "Atlantis may have been Babel's counterpart, not a structure aspiring skyward, but a metropolis extending outward, a civilization that dared to connect with the divine not through worship, but through complete command." Lucas sat in the dim light of the study room and whispered the sentence. It unnerved him. The city of rings, always portrayed in legend as majestic and formidable, had not merely existed, it had excelled, and it had attempted to reach the heavens in its own distinct manner. What followed explained the Vatican's sustained silence. Father Erhard posited that Atlantis was not annihilated because it was wicked, but because it was potent. Excessively potent. Its people had achieved unified cognition, advanced technology, perhaps even spiritual dominance. And such unity, if left unchecked, would inevitably challenge the authority of heaven. Babel had risen and been fractured. Atlantis had flourished and been submerged. Two narratives, two warnings, one ultimate truth. Luca turned to the final page of the essay. There, in one quiet sentence, was Erhard's most hazardous idea. The risk lies not in recalling Atlantis. The risk lies in becoming it once more. There was no signature, no date. The paper had never been reproduced. And in the corner, again, was the symbol, a circle, a cross. Luca leaned back, the ceiling receding into shadow. The Vatican had not buried Atlantis to preserve the historical record. They had buried it to prevent its recurrence. And now, piece by piece, that recurrence was no longer merely hypothetical. It had already begun. Brother Luca felt it, an unseen current drawing him further in, guiding his hands to the places the Church had laboured to erase. He no longer searched as a researcher, he searched as an observer. The papers, the maps, the chiselled stones. They were no longer fragments of a distant past. They were omens, and they were rousing. The next indication originated from an old reliquary log inscribed in faded ink, dated the year 1572. It itemised sacred objects secured for safeguarding, not for veneration. Most were expected: saintly remains, pieces of wooden crosses, remnants of ancient vestments. But one entry was unique: nautical map of unknown origin, stored in copper casing, to be opened only by candlelight. Bleeds upon contact, do not exhibit. The language was perplexing. Bleeds? It had to be a metaphor, a dramatic description. Nevertheless, Luca submitted a request to view it, though he was cautioned it had not been accessed for over a century. The reliquary was situated beneath the old chapel, near the perimeter of the Vatican wall, in a locked room permeated by the smell of dry earth and wax. The copper container was heavy, sealed with 3 clasps. A faint hint of brine clung to it, despite the distance from the ocean. Luca opened it slowly, candle held steady, as the instructions mandated. Inside was the map, thin as old parchment, darkened by the passage of time. Drawn in crimson ink, it depicted the western coast of Europe, the recognisable outline of Spain and the curve of North Africa. And far out on the water, rendered in deep swirling lines, was the ringed island, Atlantis. But it was not the image that startled him. It was the formation of a red droplet as the candlelight warmed the paper. A bead of liquid formed at the centre of the island. Initially he dismissed it as an illusion, but then another followed, slowly descending the parchment. Luca dabbed it with a cloth. The stains spread like actual blood. He froze. He had seen wax liquefy, parchment deteriorate, but this was neither. The map was weeping. Not ink, not moisture. Something else. Something visceral. In the corner of the casing, Folded beneath a velvet liner was a note written in Old Latin. "This is the wound that never closed. Incinerate after viewing." Luca did not destroy it. He closed the map, placed it back in the case, and locked it once more. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the sudden knowledge. Atlantis was not only a location, it was a grievous injury, a rupture in history the Vatican had attempted to bandage, not heal. And now, centuries later, the injury had begun to weep again. Brother Luca could not shake the feeling that something deep within the Vatican itself was reacting, responding to his discoveries, as if memory, once suppressed, was now pulling at the foundational threads of the stone. And one such thread led him downward to the forgotten corners of St. John Lateran. There were hushed accounts circulated among the senior brothers about a sealed chapel beneath the basilica. It was absent from public blueprints, unmentioned in official tours, yet it existed. Luca found a single reference to it buried in a footnote to a maintenance log from the early 1930s. It noted structural concerns near an old stairway sealed off after refurbishments, marked only with the words "Sub Quorum Circulorum" below the choir of circles. Aided by a trustworthy maintenance worker, Luca located the blocked entrance behind a sequence of marble panels. The ceiling was flawed. Time had fractured the cement. He squeezed through the narrow gap, his candlelight casting shadows on walls that had not felt human breath or voice in decades. The air carried the scent of aged dust and cold metal. The space was restricted at first, but then it opened into something broader, deeper. He advanced cautiously, one hand touching the wall, and then his candle illuminated it. Circles, dozens of them, painted onto the stone in gold and black, dimmed by time, but their shape still distinct, each nested within the next, a recurrent design spanning the walls and floor. And at the exact centre of the room, beneath a fractured dome, was a fresco of a city, ringed, perfectly balanced, sinking beneath dark blue waves. Atlantis. The image resonated with him like a bell rung in the void. This was no artistic embellishment. This was historical evidence. Beneath it, a Latin inscription curved around the base of the wall. Non ex aqua sed ex superba sicidit. It did not fall by water, but by pride. The message was unmistakable. The collapse of Atlantis was not purely natural. It was an act of judgment, and the Church had once preserved that message through art, not doctrine. In secrecy, not in sermons. But why this location? Why beneath one of the most sacred basilicas in the Christian world? Luca stepped back and noticed a detail he had overlooked. At the edge of the fresco, painted in lighter lines, were 12 figures in black robes standing with their heads bowed toward the sea. One carried a staff, one a scroll, and one bore the mark of the cross within a flawless circle. It was not merely a recollection, it was a stark warning. This chapel had not been accidentally overlooked. It had been intentionally concealed, because even stone cannot hold a secret forever. Brother Luca emerged from the hidden chapel with the heavy burden of silence pressing against his chest. The Vatican did not enter such symbols without a profound reason. Gold and black circles, a submerged city, cloaked figures. None of it felt like metaphor anymore. It felt like memory etched into the very framework of the Church. And then came the tale of the navigator. The report was buried in a minor Jesuit travel log from the early 1800s. Most of the file documented standard missionary activities in North Africa, but one appendix was filed under medical observation rather than theological reports. Luca nearly missed it. A sailor funded by the Vatican and posted to Morocco had returned after almost 3 years at sea. His name was Father Thomas Corrado. He had no history of ailment, but upon his arrival in Rome something was fundamentally wrong. He could no longer speak his native Italian, nor even Latin. Instead, he spoke in a language nobody recognized, smooth, rhythmic, and urgent. It was not delirium. He could read, walk, pray, but every sound from his mouth was in the same unknown dialect. Even in his sleep, he uttered it. Luca traced the report to a psychiatric wing once managed by the church. A single file remained from Corrado's case, undated, marked non-communicandum. Inside, a bizarre note, not from a physician, but from a linguist brought in to analyse the navigator's speech. It read, "The sounds resemble early Greek, but are more ancient, more resonant, possibly pre-Hellenic. The subject continually repeats certain terms that mirror names found in Plato's Critias. One in particular, nephon azaloses, is spoken as a place of light before submergence. A place of light before submergence." That phrasing sent shivers through Luca. He had heard similar descriptions in the myths of Atlantis, but never so directly connected to a real man. Father Corrado had brought something back with him, something imprinted on his consciousness, as if drawn up from the abyss itself. The final page in the file was an attempted transcription, incomplete and fragmented. It began. They called the rings sacred. Each was a portal. The light passed through the third. The fourth was consumed by fire. The fifth never returned. Corrado passed away within weeks of his return, the cause unspecified. But in his final days, he had repeatedly drawn circles, always circles. Luca studied the sketches, and there it was again, the emblem, a cross positioned just inside the third ring. The fifth never returned. Luca sat alone in the quiet of his study that night, contemplating the navigator's last notations. If Corrado's words were true, then something beneath the sea did not just retain memory. It communicated, it summoned, and for one man, the journey across the water had claimed more than his voice. It had gifted him a language older than the church itself. Brother Luca could still hear the syllables in his mind, alien and fluid, as if whispered through water. Nephonazalos, the place of light before submergence. The navigator's voice, the ancient terms, the endless rings, they all pointed to one conclusion he had tried to deny. Atlantis was not a legend, it was a memory, inscribed in stone, depicted in hidden chapels, buried beneath the church's most enduring doctrines. And now the very ground was ready to reveal it. News arrived by chance, a brief reference in a scientific bulletin submitted to the Vatican's Office for Archaeology. A university research team, conducting foundation surveys along the banks of the Tiber River, had located a hollow chamber beneath the river silt, encased in stone. Initial scans indicated a vertical structure, narrow and high. The report classified it only as an anomaly, likely Roman. But one detail was prominent. The carvings on the exterior stone were not Latin. They were archaic. Brother Luca visited the site under the pretext of evaluating excavation procedures. The digging had been halted, the area sectioned off without official explanation. The workers spoke in hushed, anxious tones. One claimed they had uncovered a sealed staircase, another insisted their tools could not penetrate the stone. Luca refrained from asking direct questions. He asked to see the inscriptions. A single slab had been lifted out, dark, polished, incredibly smooth, and across its surface, etched so subtly it was visible only when illuminated by the sun. A solitary etching lay slanted upon the rock face, a motif of concentric circles at its core, suggesting a structure that was neither truly a tower nor entirely a temple. It was slender, like an obelisk, and far too high for anything in the Roman architectural style. Directly beneath this drawing was the distinct symbol of a circle bisected by a cross. He moved closer, pressing his palm to the stone. It radiated heat, not the warmth of the sun, but a deep, vibrant, living heat. Luca breathed the recurring phrase to himself once more. The missing fifth man never reappeared. Was this spire a remnant from a time before Rome's foundation? Submerged long before the empire, the shifting river had swallowed everything over centuries. But why this exact spot? Why rest beneath the city that contained the Vatican itself? A new possibility arose. What if Rome was established here, not by chance, but specifically because of what was concealed below? The Vatican always claimed a divine reason for its location, yet what if that purpose was rooted deeper than sacred texts? What if the church was raised on the ruins of a much older sanctuary? Luca started to leave, then hesitated. Just above the engravings, partly obscured by soil, was an unfamiliar word. 5 flowing letters, etched so lightly they were nearly invisible. It was neither Latin nor Greek, but it was the identical word the deceased navigator had scribbled just before his end. Nephen, the sunken city, hadn't just been revealed, it had named itself Nephen. The word lingered in Brother Luca's mind long after he departed the riverbank. It was an undertone beneath every document he reviewed, every step he took through the Vatican's polished marble corridors. Whatever Atlantis had been, it had not vanished without leaving its designation. The church had been aware, and someone had chosen secrecy. Luca's investigation led him next to the Vatican's printing office, a quiet annex near the edge of the Apostolic Palace, filled with the faint thrum of machinery and the fragrance of ink and parchment. He sought not finished volumes, but one that had been halted. An internal reference in the archive had pointed him to a late 1800s entry. The title was strange. Echoes of the Deep, Pre-Flood Civilizations in Christian Memory, a scholarly work by 3 Jesuit historians that correlated ancient myths with scripture. Luca reviewed the abstract. The final part was titled The Drowned Kingdom and the Tower That Spoke, but the book was never published. A letter in the file stated the project was cancelled by the personal decree of Pope Leo III. The note was brief, only 5 lines. This volume, though meticulously prepared, opens a door that must remain closed. History must advance. Let no one disturb what slumbers below. No changes, no discussion. The entire printing run was stopped mid-production. Only one draft was bound. Luca requested access. He was shown into a climate-controlled room beneath the print hall. The volume rested on a velvet stand, pristine, its spine uncreased. As he turned the pages, the narrative voice shifted. The work began as quiet, academic contemplation, but by the concluding sections the tone became strained, insistent. The authors were no longer comparing legends. They were building an argument. They asserted that the Genesis flood and the downfall of Atlantis were not separate events. They were 2 perspectives on the same rupture, the same loss. Furthermore, they proposed that a proto-language, a tongue spoken before Babel, before division, before judgment, had once existed and was buried with the city beneath the waves. At the bottom of the last page, a sentence had been heavily marked out in ink, yet not thoroughly obscured. Luca held it up to the light. We were not meant to remember Nephen, we were meant to forget it. But forgetting was the initial error. He closed the book softly, the tension in his chest rising like a tide. The Pope had not dismissed the work because it was absurd. He had suppressed it because it came too close. The Church had always protected its doctrines, but Atlantis, Nephen, was something else entirely. It was a truth the Church had once attempted to erase and could never fully bury. Brother Luca felt that every page he encountered was no longer a finding. It was a reawakening. The past was breaking its silence, and the deeper he followed its trail, the more it challenged the limits of his faith. The next clue came not from a text, but from a hushed word. An elderly nun, nearly blind, who spent her days meticulously copying manuscripts, mentioned a rarely visited room. She called it the Chamber of Mistaken Prophets. Luca inquired cautiously, and after a silence, she conceded. "You will not find clarity there," she said, "but you might find the words that burned." The room was small, located 2 levels beneath the Vatican library, secured by 3 gates. Luca utilized his increasing access to enter, a privilege no one questioned, although the quiet around him intensified with every step. Inside, dust hung in the dim air like fine ash. Among the delicate scrolls and cracked bindings, he discovered a book with no spine title, its leather cover dry and brittle. Inside were writings labelled as apocryphal, do not translate. One stood out, a parchment in Aramaic, labelled only Gospel Fragments, Salt and Flame. It was ancient, perhaps from the 2nd or 3rd century. The script was hurried, as if copied from memory and fear. Luca's linguistic training allowed him to decipher enough. The passage spoke of a prophet who warned not of sin, but of forgetting. He described a city with gates of white fire and salt embedded in its foundations. A place where people chanted the stars to earth and attempted to anchor heaven to stone. Then the ocean arrived. Not as punishment, the prophet stated, but as silence. They understood too much. Their towers reached into the holy flame, and heaven in sorrow folded the city into the salt. What struck Luca most was not just the content, but the rhythm. The cadence felt familiar. It read like a faint echo of the book of Isaiah, yet older, more raw, as though the source that inspired the prophets had once passed through a different city, long before Jerusalem. At the bottom of the parchment was a name, not the author's, but a location, Nephen. Written not in Aramaic, but in that same fluid, ancient script the navigator had used. The sea hadn't merely submerged the city, it had folded it, like a book closed forever. And yet, here it was, reopened. Luca stood in the cold quiet of that chamber, holding the fragment in both hands, his pulse racing. What if this gospel was not a narrative of wrongdoing and atonement? What if it was a warning, a record of humanity's initial failure, inscribed not in stone, but in salt and flame? Brother Luca left the chamber of mistaken prophets, that thought firmly fixed in his mind. He now moved with the caution of a man bearing something delicate, ancient, and newly awakened. The more he searched, the clearer it became that the Vatican had not concealed one narrative, but many, like scattered pages from a book too dangerous to be read aloud. He was unsure how he located the scroll. It was unlisted in the official archive catalogue. Its position was handwritten on a torn scrap of paper tucked into the back of a forgotten inventory file from the early 1700s. No name, no creator, just a single word inscribed in the margin, Solmaris. The name felt gentle, like breath on glass. It was not Latin, not Greek, but it had the sound of something once sung. The chamber where it was housed was beneath the 4th floor of the Apostolic Library, behind a secured door most presumed led only to broken furniture and dust. But behind an unmarked wooden shelf, sealed in a velvet-lined case, was the scroll. Its casing was pale wood, water-damaged, but whole. And as Luca unrolled the initial few inches, he instantly saw its uniqueness. The script was exquisite, long, graceful lines inked in a deep violet, unaffected by time. The scroll began with one sentence written in Latin by a later scribe. They walked in rings, then burned. The remainder was untouched. The original language was unknown, though suggestions of Old Greek danced within its shapes. As Luca read the first section, the scroll described a place not named Atlantis, but detailed exactly as Plato had. Concentric circles, white stone fortifications, a dazzling temple at its core. But unlike Plato's version, this one expressed no pride. It did not speak of rulers or battles. It spoke of sorrow, of a city that had been complete and had suffered an unstated loss, not through retribution, but through silence. And then the phrase recurred, embedded within the scroll's centre. They walked in rings, then burned. A procession, a ceremony, a populace encircling a central light, drawing near, too near, and then consumed. The burning was not literal fire, it was a kind of knowing. It was a type of memory too burdensome to hold, so they folded it into language, sealed it in symbols, and allowed the water to hide it. Luca read until the ink became indistinct. At the very end of the scroll, in a final line, were the only words written in Latin. Solmaris est memoria. Solmaris is memory. He rolled the scroll shut with shaky fingers. Atlantis was not merely a location. It was a memory the planet itself had attempted to erase. And the Vatican, quietly, meticulously, had kept it preserved. Brother Luca was starting to sense it everywhere now. The magnetic pull, the cadence, the feeling that something beneath his feet was stirring, not as myth, but as memory. One that had waited too long and would soon surface. He returned to the archives not as a researcher this time, but as a person being pursued by an idea, or perhaps by a truth that had been trying to find him all along. It was in the lower level of the classified archive that he first heard about the cabinet. It had no official entry, no catalogue, no key. Just a record of denied applications spanning centuries, each file requesting permission to access the unmarked wooden cabinet in Chamber 3. All were stamped with the same Latin response. Access not granted. Contents remain unfiled. Luca walked the narrow stone passage late at night, past rusty sconces and heavy doors. Chamber 3 was colder than the others, as if the stone held a chill beneath it. In the farthest corner, partially hidden behind a bowing shelf of forgotten papal decrees, he located it. The cabinet was tall and slim, crafted from dark, unpolished timber. There were no markings, no lock, but the door refused to open. Luca traced the edge with his fingers. It felt warm, not from the sun, but like an exhaled breath. He stepped back and noticed an anomaly. The floor beneath the cabinet was not the same stone as the rest of the chamber. It was wood, layered over something else. He knelt and pried loose a plank. Beneath it, a smaller cavity. Inside, wrapped in black fabric, was a rusted key. The cabinet opened silently. Inside were 3 items: a rolled map sealed in wax, a small leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with drawings of circles and broken columns, and a thin silver ring, too large for a finger, etched with minute symbols that faintly gleamed even in the dim light. The map displayed no names, only shapes. An island with fragmented rings surrounded by notations in an unknown language. The ledger had no named author, only a date, March 1675. Its final page read, "I saw it once, just below the surface. It pulsed like a star. They instructed me to forget. I never did. And the ring?" When Luca touched it, he felt a low vibration, like an underwater chime. The cabinet was not simply a storage unit. It was a caution. These were the items the Vatican had recovered but could not rationalize. So they concealed them, not from adversaries, but from themselves, because certain memories are not meant for study. They are meant to be sealed, and yet they always find a way back. That thought accompanied Brother Luca like a shadow as he exited the chamber. The ring, the map, the ledger. They vibrated with the same peculiar resonance he had felt since finding the Solmaris scroll. It was as if these artifacts had been waiting for him, or for anyone prepared to look closely. But not every silence could be broken with a key. Some remained unread by intention. The Jesuit library was close to the apostolic archives. Although it felt distant, it was quieter, more substantial, lined with dark oak shelves that curved like ribs around the core of the church's most protected scholarship. Most of the books were theological, ancient and worn, copied by generations of meticulous hands. But one book was different. Luca had heard of it from an aged Jesuit scholar who spoke of it not with fear, but with a weary reverence. They catalogued it, he had said, but never read it. The language does not correspond to any we recognize, yet every man who handles it, claims to understand just enough to retreat. It was housed in a locked niche behind 2 layers of glass. The cover was pale and smooth, like fish skin, stitched with silver thread at the edges. No title, no author, just a symbol, 3 concentric circles surrounding a flame. It had no record of ever being borrowed. Luca was given access under the pretext of a request for comparative translation, a subtle deception fueled by a genuine desire for truth. When he opened the cover, the pages seemed to whisper, not audibly, but in the recesses of his thoughts. The symbols on the pages faintly shimmered. They resembled no alphabet he had ever seen. Yet, somehow, his mind translated them into meaning. Not complete sentences, but vivid images. A tower touching the sea, a song that fractured the sky, and people, not ancient but strangely familiar, walking in circles beneath a fiery canopy, their mouths open in either prayer or alarm, he couldn't discern which. The text described a place called Halor-Sur, which the notes claimed translated to City of the First Light. But in one margin, a faint Latin scrawl hinted at something deeper. Nephon est Halor, the drowned is the first. And again, that recurring name, Nephon, as if the book itself carried its echo across time. The final page was blank until Luca touched it. Then a single line appeared in bright, sharp silver ink. Return what you remember, or it will return you. He snapped the book shut, his hands cold. The Vatican had safely stored the volume for centuries, but some knowledge does not require readers. It only requires time. And time, Luca was starting to realize, was running short. It was not a dramatic revelation, not loud or panicked. It came to him like a shiver beneath the skin, as if something buried long ago was slowly stirring in its sleep. And now, like so many pieces before it, another door opened, not with a key, but with a name, quietly offered by a custodian who had worked beneath the Vatican gardens for more than 30 years. "You are seeking old stones," the man had said softly. "Then you must see the floor no one admits is there." Luca followed him at twilight down a side path behind the main basilica. They passed through a rusted gate and then through an old gardener's shed with a brick floor. The custodian lifted a wooden plank. Beneath it, a ladder descended into dark earth. No light, only soil and stone. At the bottom was a narrow passage, wide enough for one person, carved in smooth curves. They walked in silence, the only sound the soft scraping of boots against ancient dirt. After 10 minutes, the tunnel opened into a low chamber, and there it was, the mosaic. No external light source was necessary. The floor caught the faint illumination from their lantern and seemed to glow. Not brightly, but with a soft shimmer, like starlight reflected on water. Circles, always circles. 6 flawless rings constructed from thousands of tiles, each no larger than a fingernail. White, gold, deep blue, and a colour Luca could not identify. Not quite red, not quite purple, like the shade of blood beneath the skin. At the centre of the rings was an image, a city. Not buildings, just shapes radiating outward with spires rising from the middle like a crown. But the most striking detail came from a small inscription just outside the last ring. Latin, barely visible. Visible only at solstice. Remember the fall. The custodian nodded. It only appears twice a year. The light bends through the garden above and hits this room. Then the floor sings. Sings? Luca asked. The man nodded again, slowly. It hums, like breath trapped in stone. The Vatican officially denied this chamber existed. No records, no blueprints, and yet here it was, constructed centuries ago beneath the very heart of the church's garden. Why? Why entomb a memory in tile and shadow? Why communicate in symbols only sunlight could awaken? Luca stepped onto the edge of the mosaic. His breath hitched, a warmth spread beneath his feet, the same pulsation he felt when he held the ring, when he touched the scroll, when he read the forbidden book. It was all connected. The narratives, the visions, the silence. The church had not forgotten Atlantis. It had preserved it in shadow, in stone, and in circles that would never fully close. That realization stayed with Brother Luca into the morning, clinging to his coat as he walked the polished halls of the archive one last time. There was one final name on his list. Not a place this time, but a person. A former archivist named Father Silvano Moretti, who had worked deep within the classified collections until his retirement in 1973. Official records stated Father Moretti died peacefully in a small monastery in the Apennines. A quiet end to a quiet life. But the file also contained a final item, a sealed envelope addressed simply for the next one who asks. No one had ever opened it until now. Luca was granted permission under Vatican protocol, though the cardinal who approved it watched him for a long moment and said only, "Be careful. Silence is sometimes the kindest record we keep." The envelope was yellowed, brittle at the edges. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded 3 times. Luca unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear the corners. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, the script of someone who had witnessed too much and had waited too long to speak. To the one who finds this. I was never meant to remember. I was trained to file, to sort, to forget. But some knowledge refuses to stay forgotten. I saw the name once, Nephen, carved not on parchment but into the wall behind a sealed chamber. Beneath it, a handprint, not painted but burned into the stone. They knew where it was, and they feared what remembering it would unleash. I followed a path once, as you are now. I found a book bound in salt-cracked leather, written in a language that seemed to bleed when touched. I saw a painting hidden behind the papal apartments, a city ringed with flame, floating on dark water. The caption beneath it said, "Not a warning, a mirror." I asked too many questions and I was advised to rest. So I did. I left. But I never forgot. If you are reading this, then the Vatican is listening again. Or perhaps it is bracing for what is stirring. The course you are on is a known one, but it is treacherous. Its danger is not found in heresy, but in how it brings memory too close to power. Do not attempt to prove anything. Do not attempt to publish. Just recall what they chose to conceal. Nephen resides where the water never rests. Father Silvano Moretti. Luca's hands trembled as he folded the note. The question was no longer whether Atlantis had been real. The true mystery was much older, much colder. What did it mean that the Church knew and yet chose to remain silent? Brother Luca was convinced. The Vatican had pursued Atlantis. That part of the puzzle was resolved, but now a deeper concern was surfacing, not whether the Church believed in Atlantis, but whether it had feared it. And if so, what was so threatening that quiet was safer than the truth? The next indication arrived as another quiet secret. Deep in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's office, hidden among old trial documents from the Church's first centuries, was a frail page labelled Non Canonica. Not official, not approved, yet not destroyed. The folder was titled Letter Attributed to Onesimus, Disciple of Paul, Recovered near Ephesus. Luca held the parchment gently. The ink was faint in spots, but the writing was readable. Penned in the graceful script of early Greek, it started like many early Christian messages. Praise, longing, a mention of travel. But midway through the mood shifted. The writer described a vision. He spoke of a submerged city where angels wept and people constructed temples of salt. He wrote of hearing voices from the deep, not with terror, but with sorrow. The city, he claimed, had once ascended too near to heaven, and heaven in sadness had consumed it. The final lines stopped Luca completely. I saw its stones beneath the water, and they burned without fire. Paul instructed, let no man approach where God has turned his face. But still I remember the circles, the sea grieved around them. Luca paused. The circles. It was always that same form, that same warning. This letter, if genuine, placed the recollection of Atlantis not merely in legend or philosophy, but at the very foundation of early Christianity. He searched further and located the note attached to the document. A hurried comment by a Vatican academic, dated 1948. Authenticity unverified. Probably apocryphal, but the similarities to the Solmaris scroll are troubling. Suppress. It had been sealed for 75 years. Luca leaned back in his chair, feeling the impact of everything. The scrolls, the letters, the hidden rooms. The gospel from Ephesus was not about dogma or miracles. It was a remembrance, not just of a place, but of a disaster. The kind of downfall that echoed across centuries. What if Atlantis was erased not as retribution, but as compassion? What if God turned away not in fury, but in sorrow? The secrets were no longer hidden. They were waiting. And the submerged city still whispered, not with noise, but with quiet, ancient prayer. It was that silence, Luca understood, that now pulled him onward more than anything else. Not the symbols, not the scrolls or drawings or visions, but silence. Not the kind that fills a room, but the kind that empties it. The kind of quiet that consumes sound, like the sea consumes light. One hallway in the Vatican archives had always remained sealed, even to experienced archivists. There was no formal reason, no explanation, just a quiet understanding that the entrance stayed locked and that anyone who entered emerged changed. Luca by this time knew how to open it. He waited until the corridors emptied. The marble grew cold in the evening, and the air in the deeper parts of the archive carried the scent of pulverized stone and ancient parchment. When he reached the corridor, he anticipated some struggle. But the door, heavy and iron-bound, yielded to his touch. Inside was a space with no light switch, no windows, no bookshelves or documents. Just 4 stone surfaces, a low ceiling, and a single stand in the middle. On the stand sat a 3-sided stone, smooth and sharp at the edges, dark like obsidian. And the silence. Luca whispered a word to check it, but nothing returned. No echo, no sound. It was as if the space absorbed every utterance. The moment it left his lips, even his breathing seemed softer here. He walked around the stand slowly. The stone bore faint markings, subtle, almost ghostly, barely visible unless the light hit it just right. 3 circles, always the circles. But in their centre was something new, a spire, a form similar to a church steeple or a tower. Beneath it, a sequence of carved lines that looked like waves or fire. As Luca moved in closer, something shifted. Not in the stone, but in the room. The air grew heavier, not from pressure, but from memory. It felt as if someone or something else had arrived. But the door was still closed, and then he realized he could not hear his own heart. Not panic, not fear, just absence. Complete, perfect quiet. And in that stillness, a thought took shape in his mind, one that was not his own. A phrase. This is where memory ends. He retreated, his steps silent, his breath unseen. Whatever the church had sealed within this room, it was not meant to be understood. It was meant to unmake understanding. Some truths were not hidden to be forgotten. They were hidden to prevent them from speaking. Luca left the room of silence with a strange weight pressing behind his chest. No sound followed his exit, and even as he returned to the familiar hallways above, it felt as though a part of him had remained behind. sealed in that quiet stone space. He was beginning to grasp that the Vatican had not merely concealed the story of Atlantis, it had been afraid of it. But the more profound question was not why they were afraid of it, it was who else had knowledge. That answer came from an unexpected place, a forgotten folder within the Vatican's compilation of artistic records, marked only with the name Buonarroti, Michelangelo. There were countless drawings and letters from the master. Most had been studied, made public, published, displayed. But this one, tucked between two preliminary sketches for the Sistine Chapel ceiling, had no record of ever being viewed. Luca unrolled the parchment carefully. The paper was fragile, but the ink was deep, almost too dark for its age. Initially, it seemed straightforward. A city beneath the waves, drawn with graceful curves, circular, ringed as always. Structures ascending in layered stages, each smaller than the one beneath, forming a sort of tiered crown. But at the city's centre sat a throne, and on that throne, a figure, not quite a man. The body was human, but the head was obscured by blackness, not shaded, not erased, but blotted, as if the artist had changed his mind, or attempted to hide what he saw. Beside the drawing, a single sentence in Michelangelo's own handwriting. He sees in circles and recalls too much. Luca gazed at it, holding his breath. This was no metaphor. It was a memory, or perhaps a vision. Michelangelo had spent years painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, imbuing scripture and prophecy into every stroke. But what if, during those solitary nights beneath the high dome, he had witnessed something else? Something not from above, but from below? And he had drawn it not for prestige, not for acclaim, but to expel it from his mind, to quiet it. The Vatican had never exhibited this sketch, never cited it in any examination. It remained folded, unseen, as though acknowledging it would summon something too ancient to name. Luca carefully slid the drawing back into its folder. The past was not dormant, it was remembering, and somehow one of the greatest artists in history had glimpsed that memory and chosen to darken its face. Not to forget, but to warn. Luca could still see the heavy black stain covering the figure's face as he entered the architectural archives, a small room located behind the basilica's western wing. It was always quiet here. The dust lay undisturbed. The air smelled of parchment and old linen, of glue. He had pursued a name scribbled in the corner of Michelangelo's sketch. Torre Seconda, second tower. It meant nothing at first, but the more he searched, the more he observed a pattern in the records. Blueprints, plans for refurbishment. Most were standard extensions, maintenance, minor repairs of old halls. But one captured his attention. A sequence of architectural drafts, dated 1942. The title read, Vatican Observatory Substructure Proposal. It seemed strange. The observatory was situated far from the main basilica on the papal summer estate. Why then were these plans stored with the central Vatican documents? Luca unrolled the largest sheet. Ink lines outlined two levels, a dome above, a ringed room beneath. Peculiar, since the observatory had no basement. Then in the bottom right corner he saw it. A third level. A sub-basement. It was labelled Tertia Lux, third light. But no such space existed. No construction had ever been completed. According to official documents, the plan had been rejected for funds. Yet someone had added a light pencil annotation in the margin. Excavation halted. Access limited. Next to the note was something more recent, a thermal image printout from a satellite scan in 2009. Luca's gaze narrowed. The location where the sub-basement was drawn still emitted heat, faint but steady. Something was there, something still warm, but if it had never been constructed, what was producing the signal? A priest entered the room behind him. Elderly, quiet. He nodded to Luca, then paused by the plans. "You are not the first to look," the man said softly. "But most choose not to see." Luca turned. "What is Tertia Lux?" The priest smiled sadly. "It is not a room. It is a choice. Once you descend beneath it, there is no light left to deceive you." The priest departed. Luca remained motionless. He knew the church was built on layers of memory, not in straight lines but in spirals, circles, echoes, and this neglected level, drawn but never realised. Heat rising from below might be where memory became too tangible, where the shadow in the blueprints was not a building but a warning. Some things were never meant to be discovered, not because they were false, but because they were true. In the spring of 1931, Rome was bathed in Sunday morning light. The Tiber flowed calmly. Doves scattered across the marble steps of St. Peter's Square. The city, as always, carried the weight of ages in its stones. But that day, something strange occurred inside the Vatican that no amount of sunlight could account for. Monsignor Giacomo Bellini, a bishop known for his reserve and loyalty, was discovered dead in his private residence just past the southern colonnade. His door was bolted from the inside. No evidence of a struggle, no wound, no injury. Just his body slumped next to his bed, face pale, eyes open. At first, the cause of death was thought to be a heart attack. He was in his 60s, had served quietly for decades, never ventured far from Rome. But when the official report reached the Vatican medical office, the doctor hesitated. There was water in the bishop's lung salt water. Luca had found the document in a file marked Closed Incidents Non Ecclesiastica, a collection of unexplained deaths the church had opted not to investigate further. Most were simple illness, accidents, but this case had two phrases scribbled in the margin next to the coroner's signature. No sign of water in room. Clothes dry. No external source. And one more note, circled in red, found clutching sea coral rosary. Origin unknown. Luca knew of only one other object crafted from sea coral in Vatican possession. A pendant believed to have been found in a destroyed monastery in the Azores. He rechecked the dates. The monastery collapsed in 1931, the year before Bellini's death. The rosary had never been catalogued, never mentioned again. But the bishop died, with it clenched in his hand. A coral cross pressed so hard into his palm that it left a red mark on the skin. If the water had not come from the room and the bishop had not left the Vatican, then where had he drowned? Luca stared at the report, a cold feeling in his chest. Drowned men do not leave locked rooms. Salt water does not fill lungs without a source. Unless the sea, the same one drawn in all the scrolls and maps and visions, was not always external. What if it had entered, not in tides or waves, but in memory, in retribution? And what if the bishop had witnessed something? What if he had remembered too much? Some deaths are not warnings. They are reminders. And the sea, whether beneath the Azores or hidden in Vatican vaults, remembers everything. The Vatican had long monitored those whose visions blurred into waking reality, particularly when those visions began to match secrets no one should have known. That was how the name Sister Aurelia emerged in Luca's research. Quietly on the border of a page marked with an unusual phrase next to Visionary of Flame. Restricted access. She was a cloistered nun, born in the early 1900s and raised in silence behind the thick stone walls of the Santa Clara convent. She never left the premises after taking her vows, never gave public sermons, never published a word. Yet her sketches were locked away in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, in a folder labelled Non-Doctrinal Expressions, potentially heretical. Luca found the file by chance, tracing references from the bishop's coral rosary. Inside were nearly 24 pages, mostly done in charcoal, some in faint watercolour. All of them depicted the same thing. a city of rings always in threes, concentric circles resting upon a sea, the outer edges burning red, the inner ones shaded in gold. A fire in the water. The sky above her cities was always dark. But instead of stars, Sister Aurelia had drawn eyes. Not human eyes. Too vast, too ancient. One page showed the city split in half, not by a deluge, but by what looked like light. Light that erupted from beneath, not above. In her final work, concealed behind the others, Sister Aurelia had drawn a circle formed not of structures but of people. They stood linked by the hand, their mouths open in song, and beneath their feet, written in Latin, were the words they sang until the sea remembered them. Luca held the drawing, feeling a quiet chill beneath his ribs. Sister Aurelia had no access to any theological records, no way to see maps or scrolls, no education beyond scripture. So how had she known the shape of Atlantis, the circles, the burning, the flood from below? There was no sign the Vatican had ever questioned her about it. Only one note, added by a Jesuit in 1964, penned in red ink. She speaks of things she cannot know. Do not allow further visitors. The convent closed 10 years later. Sister Aurelia's fate was never recorded. Luca leaned back in his chair, the drawing still trembling in his fingers. Some saw glimpses of the future, others recalled the past. But the most perilous ones, they recalled something deeper, something not recorded in books, but etched into the soul. And perhaps that was what the fire in the sea truly was, a memory burning its way back through time. The Vatican archivist paused at the next file. It was thinner than most, just 3 yellowed pages, and a photograph fastened by a rusty clip. The cover bore no title, just a single handwritten date, October 14th, 1987. Luca unfolded it slowly. That morning, at precisely 4:28 a.m., the bell tower of the Igreja de São Vicente de Fora in Lisbon began to chime. The sound startled the nearby nuns from their sleep and drew a few fishermen from the nearby docks. But what was more unnerving than the sound itself was the silence that followed. The bell rang only once, loud, deep, and then nothing. The most peculiar detail was not the time or the tone, it was the fact that no one had touched the ropes. The church had been locked for the evening, the belfry ladder was put away. Yet something had caused the massive bronze bell to swing. At the very same moment, over 1,000 miles away, in a quiet observatory office behind Vatican walls, a seismologist named Father Miguel Barreto registered a low, rolling tremor west of the Azores. Barely a signal on the instruments, but its signature was unusual. Slow, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. He wrote a brief report, assuming it would be filed and forgotten, but someone higher up had taken an interest. The tremor's timestamp was circled in red, and next to it someone had written in Latin, Domus vocavet. The house called. Luca stared at the attached photograph. It showed the bell, enormous, dark green with age, hanging still in the early morning light. But it was what lay at the foot of the tower that held his attention. A puddle, clear, salt water. Lisbon was miles from the Atlantic's edge. The church stood on a hill. There had been no rain. Salt water beneath a bell that rang on its own. Some called it a sign. Others dismissed it as nonsense. But Luca had begun to understand something the Vatican had always known. Sound travelled in ways that words could not, and sometimes the earth remembered, sometimes it responded. He traced a finger over the photograph in the corner. Someone had scribbled a note in fading ink. Bell matches frequency noted in Vatican catacombs. Entry restricted since 1962. The catacombs underground, beneath even the crypts. That was not chance. The bell did not just ring, it answered. And perhaps, just perhaps, what it answered was not something above the earth, but something beneath it. Luca had started to recognize a pattern in the church's secrets, like scattered fragments of a melody across time. And some of those fragments were not located in vaults or scrolls. Some were written in the quiet of sleep. In 1979, a young priest named Father Marcellus was assigned to a small parish near Lake Bolsena. He was reserved, contemplative, and dedicated to scholarship. Nothing in his history stood out. He had no record of illness, no strange visions. But after a night of fever, he woke to find pages strewn across his desk. Pages he had no recollection of writing. The ink was dry, the pen his own. The pages were covered with lines and symbols in a language he could not identify. But the handwriting was smooth, even elegant, each character perfectly formed. He showed them to a fellow priest who brought the pages to a Jesuit linguist in Rome. The Vatican quietly took the writings for analysis. That was when things became stranger. Father Marcellus began to write again, always in his sleep. Always in the same hand. No matter where he was. No matter if he locked away the pens. By morning, the pages would reappear, his bed undisturbed, his hands stained with ink. Within 4 months, he had filled over 300 pages. The language remained unknown, but a Jesuit investigator named Father Alonso made a chilling observation. The script, though unfamiliar, matched the winding rhythm of ancient Minoan texts. And embedded in the writing were recurring shapes, 3 concentric circles linked by short lines. Always the same. Luca found the images in the archive. He had seen that shape before, in the drawing by Sister Aurelia, in the fresco concealed beneath St. John Lateran. And now, in the sleep-written pages of a man who had no memory of creating them, there was one final detail, almost too bizarre to accept. After the 3rd month of writing, Father Marcellus began to talk in his sleep. The Vatican placed a recorder by his bed. When the tapes were played back, the voice did not sound like his own, and the words, once phonetically decoded, matched passages from Plato's Critias describing the downfall of Atlantis verbatim, word for word, from a man who had never read Plato. The recordings were confiscated. Father Marcellus was moved, his writing sealed away, his name removed from public records. But his final letter, hidden in a drawer and never officially filed, contained just one word: I do not sleep. The ocean does. And it appeared that the ocean's murmuring was growing louder now. Within the stillness of the Vatican's ancient records office, a thick, leather-bound ledger had remained sealed for many decades. Most presumed it was merely another medieval log containing accounts of severe weather and failed harvests. However, a chance examination by an inquisitive archivist uncovered something wholly unexpected. The volume was titled Chronicle of Waters, its date tracing back to the 12th century. It chronicled instances of extensive flooding across Europe and the Near East. The majority of the entries were brief and functional. River level rose 3 cubits, fields destroyed by the water, bridges were swept away. Yet, one notation, situated between the years 1148 and 1149, caught the attention. It did not mention a specific village. It did not identify a river by name. It stated only, not a deluge, but a recurrence. They predicted its return. The handwriting was darker than the rest, suggesting it had been revised or deliberately pressed into the page. And at the bottom of the script, an unknown hand had included a sketch. 3 circles, layered like intersecting waves, the same unique symbol. Luca slowly turned to the next page. The following record detailed a dream experienced by a monk in the northern region of Spain who claimed to have seen a drowned metropolis of golden stone. In the vision, the monk traversed the submerged avenues as the water solidified around him, and he heard a voice utter, "This is what the flood was unable to destroy." For a significant duration, the official stance of the Vatican had maintained that the narrative of Noah's flood represented the only major deluge the world had witnessed, a singular event of divine origin. But these inscriptions hinted toward a different conclusion. A separate inundation, much older, not an act of a deity, nor a divine penalty. Something more fundamental, and possibly something still awaiting its moment. Later accounts within the same chronicle spoke of the high walls of water that seemed to be singing and the metropolitan area that sank because its memory was too vivid. Peculiar phrasing, ambiguous and almost lyrical, yet in the heart of the Vatican, vague language frequently denoted concealed significance. Father Bastian, a scholar recognized for his work on unverified religious texts, once suggested in a private discussion that the flood described in the Book of Genesis was not the first, only the conclusive one. He was convinced that the Church had consistently misinterpreted the nature of water, viewing it not as a source of divine anger, but as a vessel of historical memory. Water retains information, he asserted. It conceals not only misdeeds, but narratives. Luca recalled the ancient bell in Lisbon, the salt residue near its base, the hidden writings of Father Marcellus, and now these records from 9 centuries prior, preserved inside a book that had been undisturbed for generations. The inundation perhaps had not been a catastrophic flood, it had been an admonition, or perhaps more unsettling, an open invitation. During the last days of his papacy, Pope Benedict XV rarely spoke above a quiet whisper. His physical health had deteriorated significantly by the winter of 1922, and he spent the majority of his time in a secluded room situated behind the Apostolic Palace, enveloped by perfect silence and soft candlelight. Only a few trusted staff were allowed near his presence, and even fewer realized the nature of what he had begun to perceive. According to a confidential report filed by his own personal confessor, the Pope had started describing hallucinations not of holy figures nor of angelic beings, but of a metropolitan area submerged in intense light and water. They proceed in circular patterns, he once murmured, and their vision is filled with ancient knowledge. On another occasion, upon awakening from a restless slumber, he stated simply, "It is resurfacing, and our readiness is insufficient." The cardinal attending him inquired as to his meaning, but the Pope turned his sight away and mumbled something regarding stone structures that are capable of recollection. The account was transcribed and formally archived, but it was never disclosed to the public. Only following his death, during a reserved examination of his personal items, was a handwritten message discovered beneath his pillow. It contained just a single sentence: "The protective boundary must not be compromised again." No signature was present, nor a date, merely a cautionary statement hastily inscribed in shaky handwriting. Luca had only been able to observe the original document once, secured within a container designated Privata Vaticani, buried deep within the personal collection of papal correspondence. What instantly captured his awareness was the distinct watermark pressed into the paper, not the traditional Vatican emblem, nor a Christian cross, but 3 connected circular forms. The very same symbol, discovered beneath the Lateran chapel in the monk's vision described in the Flood Chronicle and now secreted beneath the pillow of a dying pontiff. He had witnessed something profound. Whether it was a dream or a true vision, nobody could be certain. But one conclusion was undeniably clear. He was certain of its imminent return. Certain individuals within the church hierarchy dismiss these accounts as simply the irrational ramblings of a mind nearing its final moments. But others, specifically those occupying the most secluded areas of the Vatican Library, those who navigated the restricted pathways beneath St. Peter's Basilica, held an entirely different conviction. They held a profound belief in the lingering power of memory that persists in cities that are never entirely destroyed, and in the deep ocean that never truly forgets. As Luca slowly traced the outline of that historical letter, he sensed a sudden drop in the atmosphere that was unrelated to the room's temperature. It was the absolute stillness of something vast, observing, patiently waiting. Whatever the Pope experienced in those final conscious moments, it went beyond simple historical reference. It was a potent prediction. in the elevated observatory dome of the Vatican, situated on top of the papal summer residence at Castel Gandolfo, a scientist named Father Ernesto Bellini spent his evenings looking into the celestial sphere, but his focus was not on finding new planets or comets or traditional celestial indications. He was deliberately seeking something far older, an entity that did not naturally belong in the vastness of space. In 1902, Bellini reviewed a historical star chart meticulously created by a Jesuit astronomer more than 50 years earlier. The chart displayed great artistry and precise accuracy, illustrating the star formations visible above the North Atlantic region. But in one peripheral corner, where only open ocean should have been depicted, the elderly astronomer had outlined a landmass. It was entirely unnamed, with no identifying label, only 3 straightforward words written in Latin. Terra submersa expectat. The sunken land is waiting. Bellini, intrigued, verified newer editions of the map. The landmass was absent, completely erased, as though its existence had been purely imaginary. He managed to locate the original parchment document, stored securely in a sealed, protective container within the observatory's restricted vault. When he carefully held it up to the candlelight, he noted an unusual detail, a faint glistening of crystalline salt across the perimeters of the inked lines, as if the map itself had been quickly submerged in the sea or had absorbed something from the surrounding air itself. Over the course of the following months, Bellini developed an intense preoccupation. He thoroughly examined logbooks, telescope measurements, and early photographic records. Repeatedly, he returned to that exact expanse of water situated west of the Azores, an area which, according to contemporary charts, held nothing but extremely deep water. But in one photograph, taken precisely during a strong solar flare event, he detected a subtle, faint, domed structure. Not merely a passing cloud formation, nor a transient ocean wave, something clearly and rigidly fixed. He formally submitted his extensive findings to the Secretary of State, requesting immediate financial support from the Vatican for a specialized marine exploration mission. The official reply was instantaneous and unequivocal. Do not pursue this line of investigation any further. The subject has already been given due consideration. Your professional expertise is required elsewhere, immediately. Soon afterward, Bellini was formally reassigned to a mandatory theological review panel in the city of Florence. He never directed his gaze toward the cosmos again. However, in the perfect solitude of his last year, Bellini urgently scribbled a short message in the marginal space of a heavily used observatory logbook. It is not the celestial bodies that are returning. It is the ocean itself. The stars merely reflect its presence. Luca finally discovered that specific note many years later. The ink was significantly faded, yet the inherent sense of dread still lingered. What exactly had the astronomer witnessed? What specific information had the Church attempted so actively to conceal? Perhaps the true answer was not found high above us, but deeply beneath. And possibly, just possibly, the stars had served merely as elaborate reflections, revealing to us what we had deliberately and completely put out of our collective minds. The narrow corridor that ultimately led to the room was not accurately indicated on any formal Vatican cartography. It was hidden discreetly behind a simple, unadorned wooden panel in the eastern section of the Apostolic Palace, only just wide enough to allow a single individual to pass through at a time. The confined passage emitted a distinct smell of ancient cold stone and pure beeswax, and the surrounding walls appeared to absorb all sound with an unsettling silence. Father Giulio was among the rare few still living who had ever been permitted to enter what was formerly referred to as La Stanza del Sal, the Room of Salt. A private chamber utilised in strict secrecy only one single time each year. No formal announcements were ever made, no religious mass was ever performed. Just 5 chosen Jesuit priests, clothed in simple black vestments, solemnly descending together after the sun had fully set and securely locking the heavy door behind them. Inside this private space there were no customary pews, no central altar, only a perfectly round circular table carefully shaped from dark volcanic stone, and surrounding it 5 unlit taper candles precisely moulded in the shape of natural seashells. Beneath the prominent table, the floor was elaborately decorated with inlaid symbols unlike anything discovered elsewhere in the Vatican, neither traditional Latin nor ancient Greek. A powerful, unfamiliar language that seemed to subtly resonate with immense age, its carved lines worn exceptionally smooth by countless silent feet over the centuries. The sacred prayers were audibly recited from a heavily aged, brittle scroll stored within a highly polished silver cylinder. The esoteric text was not written in any officially recognized or known language, and yet the chosen men who were speaking it knew precisely the profound meaning it carried. That knowledge was an integral part of their oath, the fifth depth. It was a secret not learned from books, but deeply recalled. And without fail, after the ritual words were spoken, the atmosphere would subtly change. The stone walls would appear to weep. Crystal clear salt water, frigid as the deepest night, would form beads along the masonry and fall in quiet drops, as if the chamber itself mourned a long-forgotten home. Julio had once asked, many years earlier, the meaning of the chant. His mentor simply told him, "They are not our words. We only serve to carry them forward." Yet Luca had uncovered something more profound. A brief notation within a discarded journal. It traced the origin of the prayer to a time described as pre-Adamic, a phrase seldom used even within the Vatican Library's most confidential sections. Older than the garden, older than the flood itself. It was rumoured that those who recited these salt prayers could sense an entity below them, listening, waiting patiently. Then, one year in 1973, the prayers abruptly ceased mid-ceremony. A Jesuit tumbled backward and began speaking in a voice utterly foreign to his own. He described a city submerged under the ocean where gold drifted freely and shadows had no defined shape. His eyes turned jet black, then snapped back to normal. When the episode ended, he retained no memory of it. That Jesuit was never seen in public again, and the scroll he had touched that evening was sealed away, placed inside a stone container, and below the box a single word was inscribed, Thalassa, the ancient name for the sea that holds all memory. In the cool, hushed atmosphere of the Vatican Museum's Egyptian wing, beneath the steady dim lights, there was one exhibit that remained perpetually concealed, not for preservation nor due to lack of interpretation, but by hushed directive. The display case was long and thin, featuring iron supports and a glass lid secured tightly. Inside, resting on dark velvet, lay a single roll of papyrus unlike any other found. It was not the usual brown or tan of ancient documents. It was pitch black, almost oily to the touch, and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They called it the Black Papyrus. The case bore no informational label, no visitor explanation. Most museum curators had never even laid eyes on it. But for a select few inside the Vatican's hidden circle of historians, its very name caused apprehension, not because of its nature, but because of where it was said to have originated. According to restricted records, the papyrus was discovered in a sealed-off chamber beneath a ruined temple in western Egypt sometime during the early part of the 20th century. It had been wrapped in multiple layers of linen and interred inside a box carved with flowing, wave-like patterns. No hieroglyphs, no known writing, just water swirling in concentric circles. When unrolled in private by Vatican linguistic experts, they realized it was not Egyptian. It was older, substantially older. The script was fluid, made up of curved lines and symbols that appeared to alter their form depending on the angle of illumination. And then came the attempt to translate it. The text, written from right to left and curling inward upon itself, spoke of a dwelling place beneath the sea. It described a city of rings that glowed and resonated where the sky had once met the water and men communicated with the stars. It gave a warning of a collapse not caused by transgression but by arrogance, a violation of the first law that resulted in the waters surging and the sunlight disappearing. Then came the most unsettling line. The house that sank will ascend once more when human language loses the memory of the sky. The phrase instilled fear in the translators. It resonated too closely with accounts housed in other Vatican vaults. Visions, strange dreams, ancient predictions, all pointing toward an entity submerged beneath the Atlantic. Even stranger, certain sections of the Black Papyrus utilized imagery found in the books of Isaiah and Ezekiel, nearly verbatim, but had been transcribed thousands of years before those prophets existed. Luca had managed to read a copy once, concealed within a Jesuit scholarly work. It was marked non condividere, do not share. But the instant he finished, he felt the same icy stillness that permeated the salt prayer chamber. The implication was clear. Atlantis was not a mere fable. It was a dire warning, and someone long before Moses or Plato had already committed it to writing. In the winter of 1978, a young boy was brought to a secluded room deep within the Vatican's psychiatric department. He was 6 years old, slight for his age, with pale eyes that seemed to penetrate everything. His name was Elias, and his file arrived by special mandate, stamped urgent and hand-delivered. Elias had been found wandering alone near a secluded monastery in northern Portugal. He refused to speak for the first 3 days. When he finally did, he spoke of fire, of salt, and of stone towers standing beneath the water. The monks who discovered him were deeply disturbed, not because he spoke incoherently as many frightened children do, but because the language he used was not Portuguese. It was Greek, but not any dialect familiar to contemporary academics. It matched no known speech from Athens, Sparta, or Byzantium. Yet, somehow it possessed an ancient ring, echoes of something primeval. A Vatican psychiatrist named Father Corrado was assigned the case. A meticulous man, versed in both religious text and modern psychology, he began gently questioning Elias about his nighttime visions. The child never spoke with fear or confusion. His voice was uniformly tranquil, steady, as if he was simply recalling events he had personally witnessed. He described a city adorned with golden domes and dark stones that vibrated when touched, of people who walked in circuits to speak towards the heavens, of sacred sites where flame floated unsupported above the floor, and of the day the ocean descended, not with crashing waves, but in absolute silence. The sea devoured the sun, Elias whispered, and the air turned black. Corrado diligently documented every session, but after the 4th interview he heard a soft knock on his door. 2 men in dark outerwear, one carrying a leather portfolio, confiscated all his written materials. They left him with a single, firm directive. Do not question the boy again about the city. Later that month, Elias was transferred to a Jesuit facility near the seacoast. He was never seen at the Vatican again. Years passed. But in the confidential notes Corrado secretly maintained, there was one detail he never forgot. During their last meeting, Elias had traced something in the dust with his small finger. A circle, then another, and another. Concentric rings, exactly like those described in the scrolls, the maps, the mosaic no one acknowledged existed. Corrado quietly asked him, "What did you call this place?" The child looked up and answered, "I do not recall the name now. But when I lived there we called it the House of Dawn." And then, as if a mental switch had been flipped, Elias lost the memory. The following morning he recalled nothing of his tales. But Corrado would never forget, because the child had never been formally taught Greek, and yet he had spoken it like a survivor who had drowned with the language. In the summer of 1960, a group of divers was dispatched by the Vatican to explore a series of deep-sea stone ridges located off the coast of the Azores. The mission, publicly financed by a Jesuit project on maritime history, was secretly filed under a different designation, Project Thalassa. only a very few men were privy to its actual objective. One of them was Father Giancarlo Marin, a soft-spoken Jesuit who had dedicated decades as both a mapmaker and a language scholar. He had published papers on ancient flood narratives, many of which had been suppressed or quietly shelved. But, unlike his peers, he believed these old stories were not simply distorted memories, but intentional warnings left behind. On the second day of the dive, the ocean grew strange. The water, usually exceptionally clear in that region of the Atlantic, became turbid and heavy with fine silt. Despite the absence of any storm, the team lost radio communication with Father Marin around noon. His oxygen hose was discovered later, intact and undamaged, but severed cleanly in half. No logical explanation could be found. 3 weeks went by. Then, just before dawn on a tranquil September morning, a fishing boat from Madeira snagged something in its trawl nets. Entangled in layers of seaweed and coral, draped in ocean sediment, were human remains. When Vatican representatives arrived to examine the skeleton, they immediately confirmed it was marine. The rosary he carried was still tightly wrapped around his fingers, but it was the rosary itself that caused the alarm. The beads were not made of wood or common stone. They had been carved from an unknown material. Dark, shiny, almost like volcanic glass, but etched with miniature glyphs. Not Greek, not Latin. Older. And at the focal point of the rosary, where one would expect the crucifix, there was something else entirely. A spiral contained within a circle encircled by 4 tiny symbols that did not match any religious records. The Vatican's official finding declared the death an accidental drowning, but the divers who recovered the body insisted something inexplicable had occurred. One testified that as they ascended with the remains, the sea beneath them began to produce a low hum, just barely audible, like a trapped underwater whisper. No autopsy results were ever made public. No official funeral service was conducted. Marin's name was never mentioned again in Jesuit discussions, but in a hidden side room of the Vatican Library, beneath a stone arch illuminated by candlelight, there is a sealed container labelled only Marin. Inside it, carefully preserved on velvet, are the beads, which remain slightly damp to this day. And though the Vatican officially denies any link, the final sentence in Marin's last field notebook reads simply, "They are still praying down there." The words continued to trouble Father Rinaldi long after he first read them. He had been studying the Marin box alone one evening during a heavy storm in the Vatican Library, a night when distant thunder rumbled softly above the dome and the rain tapped like fingers against the stained glass windows. The sentence felt too precise, too vivid, and far too serene for a man who died underwater without air or answers. Rinaldi had witnessed many strange phenomena during his tenure with the Church, but this felt different. This was not a warning extracted from history. This was something that was still alive. That same week, another incident occurred. During the early morning mass in a small chapel near the edge of the Vatican grounds, 3 priests, none of whom had previously communicated with each other, each reported the identical experience. They claimed it started with an intense cold, as though the space had momentarily been submerged. One described a noticeable smell of salt and burnt ash. Another heard a faint, distant humming that intensified closer to the altar. All 3 reported seeing the same vision. A city composed of stone rings, not mere images or mental projections. A physical location, dimly illuminated by a strange, fluctuating light, as if simultaneously underwater and aflame. But it was not the image of the city that left them unnerved. It was the voice that followed. They did not hear it with their ears, not truly. It arrived in the way that thunder sometimes precedes the lightning flash. A pressure felt behind the ribs, not the auditory canal. They will search for the city again, but it must continue its slumber. The Vatican never released the account publicly, but it was meticulously recorded. The document, handwritten and unsigned, was filed away in the archives of unresolved phenomena, a collection of records very few even know exists. Some weeks later, a cryptic message circulated among specific Jesuit members. It posed a single question: who are they, and what occurs if it awakens? There was no response, but one of the priests who experienced the vision left the church soon afterward. He vanished from Rome without notifying anyone, leaving only his clerical collar behind, and a single note tucked into the hymnal beside his usual seating area. The note read, "It was not a city. It was a cathedral awaiting its final service." The Vatican never released a statement. The chapel where the incident took place no longer holds routine services. A small brass plaque near its doorway reads "Closed for repairs." Yet at night, if you listen closely beneath the sound of the wind, some claim you can still hear faint reverberations inside the marble walls. Not actual words, not even recognizable music. Just the prolonged, distant sound of something patiently waiting, something that remembers a time when the church feared its rediscovery. That fear had a designation. Once hidden deep within the layers of Vatican secrecy, communicated only through whispers and sealed documents. It was known as the fifth depth, a term never uttered during religious services, only in candle-lit vows sworn by those who ventured farther into the archival labyrinth than most would dare. For more than 300 years the oath was considered lost. It was thought to have perished with the final members of the old Jesuit scribes, men who signed their names with vanishing ink and recorded their confessions using reverse Latin. But in the spring of 2022, the secrecy was breached. A Vatican intern tasked with cataloguing relics for a digital preservation effort discovered a scroll incorrectly shelved in a compartment marked ceremonial texts. Its parchment was fine, almost transparent, and bore no identifying title. But when it was carefully unrolled, the ink possessed a faint blue luminescence, as if it retained a memory of the ocean. The first line stated, "We swear to seek the drowned light and speak of it to no living soul." Below the vow, 13 distinct signatures, each marked with a symbol. Not crosses, not simple rings, but circles contained within circles. The identical design found on a long-lost fresco beneath St. John Lateran. The same pattern matching the ancient maps, the old prophetic dreams. Word reached the Jesuit courier service within a matter of days. The scroll was quietly retrieved. The intern was reassigned to a different department, and the filing drawer was incinerated. But the silence proved temporary. 1 week later, a reporter in Milan received an anonymous parcel. Inside was a high-resolution digital image of the scroll, along with a second photograph, a contemporary image of a basement chapel in Lisbon, its altar embroidered with the very same ringed pattern. The Vatican refused to issue a comment on either item. Internally, the matter was more substantial. A confidential memo circulated among high-ranking clergy bearing the title "Status Vow Reawakened." Most only saw the header and a blank display, but a chosen few, those with higher security clearance, saw the final line. "The oath has not died, it has merely assumed a new form. The city will issue its call again. We must be prepared to recall who we are when that moment arrives." That same month, a relatively unknown cardinal delivered a sermon in Buenos Aires. He spoke in hushed tones, never mentioning the scroll, never uttering the word Atlantis. But he concluded with a line that stood out. "There are truths we chose to bury, not because they were false, but because we feared what they might awaken within us." In the pews, one man held a folded piece of paper tightly. In his grasp, a facsimile of the vow. He would depart before the final hymn was sung. He would secure the next available flight to the Azores, and as the aircraft ascended into the night sky, he murmured a prayer in a language older than Latin. Not a request for deliverance, but a plea for continued silence. Yet silence would not endure. In the summer of 2023, a private research vessel, financed through an opaque shell company loosely connected to a Vatican financial subsidiary, mapped the seabed west of the Azores. The mission was officially categorized as geological mapping for deep-sea seismic fault lines. But the detection equipment was far too sophisticated, and the ship's manifest included not just scientists, but two quiet men in dark clerical attire who never once left the bridge. On the third day, as the vessel passed over an area previously believed to be featureless, the sonar produced an echo that defied explanation. A dome, not a natural rock formation or a geological cavern, but a perfect semisphere. Immense, unmistakably man-made, and buried beneath layers of ancient volcanic debris and sediment. The images transmitted back to the monitors showed a symmetry too precise to be natural and far too ancient to fit known human history. No structures of this scale were known to exist under the Atlantic, not according to public record. One of the men dressed in black stood up, made the sign of the cross, and exited the room. The other ordered all data recordings to be immediately encrypted and transferred to an offline drive. A command was issued. The vessel turned back that night, sailing away before the planned deep-sea dive could even begin. The captain, confused but compliant, recorded the coordinates in his personal logbook. 2 days later, when he reached port, the notebook had vanished. No one admitted to taking it. Back in Rome, the news spread quietly through the innermost Vatican circles. The phrase undersea cathedral began to surface in closed-door discussions. Some speculated it was a remnant of the pre-flood world, a relic of the submerged city, now no longer content to simply sleep. Some said softly the dome wasn't a physical spot, but a closure, a seal, and something had begun to stir under it. What made it feel even stranger was the timing. A few days after the imaging scan, an earthquake shook Lisbon, minor but unusual. The tremor originated offshore, and ancient churches reported a weird humming, bells ringing faintly without being touched. In one coastal convent, a sister woke up yelling, gripping her rosary, repeating the same phrase over and over. "It is not a church, it is a mouth." Her statement was documented by a visiting priest and personally delivered to the Jesuit Curia. He never spoke of her again, nor of the sight he witnessed that evening, the ocean pulling back much too fast, like a sudden intake of breath. From the lowest level of the apostolic palace, a document sealed with red wax was dispatched. No identity, no signature, only 5 words. "Do not return to the site." Those 5 words, secured in crimson wax, moved quicker than smoke through the marble halls of the Vatican. No one spoke them out loud, yet everyone grasped their seriousness. Behind closed doors, cardinals gathered in silence, their expressions sombre, their hands clenched tightly, as if attempting to restrain something older than simple fear. It happened on the night of a blood moon. The sky took on a rust-red colour, and the air above Rome was so unusually still that one cardinal broke his silence. He was elderly, almost 90, his vestments heavy on his small frame as he was wheeled into the secluded chapel deep within the apostolic palace. Only 3 others were permitted inside, 2 other cardinals and a young priest carrying a leather-bound book of rituals. The confession started quietly, barely audible. He didn't mention the structure under the sea, nor did he reference Atlantis, but his words circled it like a vulture hovering above a hidden carcass. It was never about legend, he declared, looking towards the wavering candlelight. It was always about authority. The priest hesitated, unsure if the words were part of a prayer. But the cardinal went on. They knew, he affirmed. They always knew. From the moment that cursed chart bled seawater onto the archive floor, the church understood. This was no simple tale. This was history, submerged under water, wiped clean by torrent and flame. He He spoke of a period during the Second World War when a whole room of papers was moved from Berlin to the Vatican under confidential orders, among them a coded manuscript, handwritten, inked in crimson, detailed a submerged city that once matched Babel in learning and arrogance. The Nazis had searched for it, so had the Vatican. We raced to locate what must remain lost, he stated, eyes unfocused. We called it a quest for truth. But it was power we desired, power that didn't originate from God. One of the other cardinals moved to quiet him, but the aged man lifted a shaking hand. Let them learn, he insisted, his voice gaining clarity. Let the world understand the dome is not waiting, it is remembering. The blood moon travelled overhead, casting a strange red illumination through the chapel's stained glass. That night the Vatican made no official comment, but the priest who had recorded the confession was reassigned the following morning, transferred to a quiet parish in the hills, far from the ocean. Years later, he would still wake some nights recalling the look in the old man's eyes. It was not fear, it was guilt. It hung over him like a persistent fog. Father Luis d'Alessandro, once a young cleric taking notes on a dying cardinal's final confession, now stood on a small Vatican ship floating silently over deep Atlantic waters. It was the spring of 1997. He hadn't worn the collar for more than 10 years, yet the church had summoned him back, not with commands, but with a request. The coordinates matched the ones from the red-stained manuscript. A dome had appeared on sonar. Not natural, not geological. Something constructed, something observant. Father Luis stood by the ship's railing. The sun was setting, and the water had become a deep violet. There was no breeze, not even the gentle sound of waves against the hull. Just stillness, a quietness that didn't feel vacant, but expectant. The others on board were not clergy. 3 scientists from the Vatican Observatory, 1 seasoned sailor, and a Jesuit diver named Salvatore. Luis had met him years earlier, when the boy was still studying languages. Now he moved like a person who had forgotten the sensation of rest. As darkness arrived, Salvatore descended beneath the surface, secured to a long cable, sinking into the blackness. With a headlamp and a water-resistant recorder, Father Luis watched the line grow taut. He listened to the soft beeping of the sonar. Silence at first, then came the voice, faint, wet, ancient, not transmitted through a radio, not heard in any mechanical way, just a sound that filled the air above the water like chanting beneath a barrier. Salvatore reappeared 10 minutes later, gasping, gripping the sides of the boat. His eyes were wide, unsettlingly so. He was shaking, salt clinging to his facial hair like frost. They helped him onto the deck, but he remained silent. Not a word. Not until the next morning, when the sun had barely risen. He drew in chalk across the side of a supply container, symbols no one could identify. They curved like waves and coiled like shells. Then he spoke the word thalassa, the sea. Father Luis recalled the sentence from the Cardinal's confession. The dome is not waiting. It is remembering. That afternoon the vessel was ordered back. No specimens, no pictures, no further dives. The excuse given was poor weather, but the sky had been clear. The actual order arrived wrapped in Vatican stationery, signed by a name Luis did not know, one he never encountered again. Years later, in a modest house in Naples, Father Luis would sometimes walk to the shore at dusk, stand quietly and listen. The water was never still, always whispering, like someone deep beneath, repeating a prayer in a language no living person should comprehend. That same soft and strange rhythm seemed to reverberate through a narrow hallway of the Apostolic Palace, where few ever walked and fewer still stopped to look up. On the wall, near a neglected archive room, hung an old icon framed in dusty gold leaf. It showed the Virgin sitting before a field of stars. Her expression was calm, but her eyes did something they shouldn't have done. They moved only slightly, only toward the west. It was Cardinal Venturi who first made a note of it in 1964. He had been walking the corridor after evening prayers when he halted, not because of the icon, but because of the cold. A draught touched his skin like a sigh from deep stone. The hallway had no windows, and yet something disturbed the air. He looked up and saw it. The icon's focus. She was not looking straight ahead, as she had for centuries, but over her left shoulder. It wasn't dramatic, not terrifying, but it was wrong. The next morning he returned. Her gaze had shifted again, westward, just a little farther. No one believed him. Maintenance records showed the icon hadn't been moved in over 100 years. The plaster was undisturbed, the frame untouched, but Venturi was not a man inclined toward fantasy. So he began leaving notes, dates, times, angles. Over the course of months and then years, a pattern became clear. Her eyes always moved right after high tide, on a full moon, always west, always in absolute silence. Eventually, Venturi marked the angle and drew it onto a global map. The line, he found, pointed not toward a known city or shoreline, but into the open Atlantic just south of the Azores, the very waters where whispers had been heard, the very place where dreams transformed into warnings. Then one night, the icon's eyes returned to facing forward, as if having finished watching. That same evening, Venturi collapsed during Mass. His final words, spoken in Latin, were not documented in any Vatican record, but a seminarian named Claudio, present at the scene, claimed he repeated 3 times. She saw it rise. The icon remains where it has always been, but today it is kept under low light. Some say this is to preserve the pigment. Others say it is because the less she sees, the longer she remains dormant. And still, on certain nights, custodians walking that hall have paused mid-step, not because they heard anything, but because they suddenly felt observed. One such night, a caretaker named Arturo stopped not from fear, but curiosity. The old corridor was dim, silent, and still carried a faint smell of incense. His flashlight wavered as he walked beneath the icon's gaze, and for a moment he thought he saw something else. Not her face, but a small shadow beneath the frame, a metal object pushed into the wood, something no one had noticed before. He reached up. What he pulled out was a brass compass, tarnished and cold to the touch. It was unlike any he had ever seen. No indicators for north or south, just a single black needle that spun and then locked into position, pointing firmly, relentlessly, in the same direction the Virgin's eyes had once looked. West. Vatican records indicate that the object was handed over to a Monsignor on duty that night, who noted its unusual style but dismissed it as a forgotten relic. But Arturo, an old sailor before his janitorial work, had recognized something the priest did not. This was not a modern compass. This was ancient, Roman in construction, but marked with Greek lettering and early Christian symbols. It carried an inscription on the back, barely visible beneath the corrosion. Pauli manus ad lucem, the hand of Paul, toward the light. Arturo, unable to sleep that night, began researching. He found mention of a letter, apocryphal and long dismissed, describing the Apostle Paul's final journey. Not to Rome, but to the western edges of the sea, where the earth remembers its collapse. That same letter, once housed in the Ephesus collection, disappeared from records in the 15th century. Arturo believed this compass was made for that voyage, not to find dry land, but to avoid it. Yet the direction it indicated never changed, no matter where he stood, as if what it sought was not magnetic, but ancient, anchored, waiting. The next morning, when Vatican security returned to inspect the icon wall, the compass was gone. Arturo, too, had vanished. All that remained was a note scribbled on the back of a supply checklist. She sees it points, but do not follow. The relic's disappearance was never officially acknowledged. The official file was closed under the heading non-essential item, but within certain inner circles, a duplicate of the compass was created, not for public display, not for history, but for readiness. Because if the Apostle Paul had once abandoned the known world to travel towards something forgotten, something submerged, then perhaps the Church had always known more than it publicly taught, and the needle still points west. Father Matteo held the replica in his hand, its cold brass pressing against his palm like a silent threat. He stood alone in the reliquary chamber beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the air thick with candle smoke and centuries of silence. Most would overlook the display at the back wall. It sat in a shadowed niche under an inscription that read, Sancta Vas Sanctuarium, the holy vessel of sanctuary. The chalice, cracked, hair-thin and almost invisible unless the light hit it just right. But the fracture was real, not from time or misuse, but from something deeper, something sensed. It had once belonged to a bishop who died during the Council of Vienne in the early 14th century. His identity was lost to history, but his cup remained. It had been found years later, sealed inside a wall behind a stone engraved with a wave pattern. The official documentation claimed it was a minor relic, yet 3 popes had ordered it locked away, and each time the same instruction was written into the restricted file. Do not let it touch water again. Matteo had always questioned why until that night. He wasn't supposed to be there, but curiosity, he believed, was a form of faith. If God acted in silence, perhaps, truth whispered. He lifted the chalice. The crack ran down the side, splitting like a vein. When he tilted it toward the lantern light, the metal seemed to subtly gleam. Not gold, not silver, but a faint blue tint hidden beneath the patina. And for just a moment he thought he saw it pulse. He didn't intend to spill the water. It was just a single drop, barely a tear's worth, from the condensation on the flask he carried in his satchel. But the instant it made contact with the inner edge of the chalice, the drop hissed. Not boiled, not steamed, but sang, a sound like breath, underwater. The room transformed. The stone surrounding him darkened like wet rock beneath the ocean. The lantern flickered. Then, just as rapidly, it subsided. Matteo put the chalice back, but the crack had lengthened. The next day, the chamber was sealed, not by request, but by order. The reliquary had been placed under investigation, after a sudden tremor was felt throughout the lower crypts. Some suggested it was structural shifting, but the engineers could not locate the source. Matteo didn't mention what occurred, but late at night he would return to his notes. Not to study religious doctrine, but geometry, tides, fault lines, and something else. A connection in relics that shouldn't connect, because the chalice was never a container for wine. It was a warning, and the crack was expanding. Matteo began having dreams of water, not rivers or lakes, but an endless heavy sea, black as ink and still as glass. In the dreams, he stood on the edge of a shoreline that existed on no map. There were no stars above him, no moon to illuminate the waves, only a low hum rising from beneath the surface, like the distant breathing of something immense, something waiting. By day he returned to his duties as a scholar priest, responding to correspondence and organising forgotten texts in the apostolic library. But every night the sea returned. It grew nearer, louder, the kind of dream that does not disappear upon waking. He recalled a passage from an old manuscript he had once seen in the restricted reading room, a piece of parchment with no title and only 6 words written in Latin. Mir tacet sednon. The sea is silent, but it does not sleep. Most would call it a metaphor, poetic nonsense. But Matteo felt it pressing against his thoughts the same way the cracked chalice had vibrated in his hand. Not an earthquake, a summons. He began to track old Jesuit logs, naval records, cargo ships that disappeared not near Bermuda, but in the western Mediterranean, close to islands no longer marked on charts. Madeira, the Azores. One report from 1947 detailed a fishing boat that came back with no crew, only the captain, whose hair had turned entirely white. He spoke only one phrase until his death 3 days later. It rose to meet us. The Vatican had seized the report. It was buried in a file labelled Non-Canonical Phenomena. But Matteo remembered the name of the investigating priest, a man who once studied ancient Atlantean myths, and so it circled back again to Atlantis, not as a vanished city, but as a boundary, a wall submerged beneath water and time, holding back something older than memory. And it was never about discovering the ruins or confirming a legend. The Vatican had been watching the water. Matteo found himself walking late into the evenings along the Tiber River, though he no longer understood why. It did not calm him. It only reminded him of the sound from the chalice, a song that lacked melody, a pressure building. He wondered if others had sensed it, if the fractured relics, the concealed maps, the sealed chapels, all pointed to the same reality, that the sea was not just waiting to be crossed, it was waiting to return. And when it did, it would not knock, it would not rise like a massive wave or scream like a fierce storm. It would whisper like breath through stone, like the hum inside a chalice. That was the sound Matteo heard again, not in a dream this time, but beneath the Vatican itself, in the deepest part of a forgotten corridor known only on the oldest blueprints. It was listed not as a room nor a crypt, but as a tunnel, a wind passage. Its original function was unknown, sealed off after a minor earthquake in the early 17th century. But Matteo had found a reference tucked between architectural footnotes in a worn codex, a marginal note in fading ink. Cavea spirit sed non loquitur. The tunnel breathes, but it does not speak. Except, now it did. He had descended with only a lantern hidden beneath his vestments. The entrance was behind a rusted iron grate beneath the mosaic floor of a chapel that no one visited anymore, a place once dedicated to St. Clement, the patron saint of mariners. The air changed as he went down. The steps curved in a slow spiral, more like a seashell than a conventional staircase. The deeper he went, the less the flame wavered until it seemed the air itself was holding still, expectant. Then he heard it. A whisper. Soft, low, almost too faint to notice unless he stood perfectly still. At first he thought it was air moving through cracks in the ancient stone. But the sound had rhythm, like syllables in a language he did not know, or rather almost knew. He raised the lantern. At the bottom of the stair was a door, not constructed of wood or iron, but carved from a single slab of dark stone. Obsidian, perhaps. The Vatican held no record of this tunnel and no mention of this door. But there, etched across its surface, were curved lines that resembled the same symbols he had seen on the cracked chalice, a map or a warning. And then something shifted. Not beyond the door, but within the tunnel itself. The air pulled sharply against his face, not like a gust of wind, more like a breath drawn inward. The whisper ceased. He should have retreated, but he stepped forward, hand against the stone, and the moment his skin touched it, he felt the hum in his bones, not just in his ears, in his ribs, his chest, the spaces behind his eyes, a memory not his own, a city swallowed in quiet, a bell ringing beneath water, and above it all, a voice, not speaking but waiting for someone to pay attention. Matteo stumbled backward, heart pounding. The hum receded. The whisper returned, now fainter. As if sensing his withdrawal, he left the tunnel, sealed the grate behind him. But that night, as he lay in bed, his ears rang with a sound he could no longer ignore. It was not wind, it was a voice repeating coordinates. Matteo wrote them down before the memory faded, his hand trembling as he lit a candle by his bedside. The numbers were strange, half embedded in Latin numerals, half in what looked like old Phoenician symbols. It took hours, but he finally matched them to a set of underwater ruins near the Azores, far beyond the reach of normal navigation. The next morning he brought the coordinates to Father Lucien, an archivist so old he seemed sculpted from stone. The old man listened without interruption, his lined face impassive. When Matteo finished, Lucien walked to a locked cabinet behind his desk, inserted a brass key, worn nearly smooth, and retrieved a book wrapped in cloth. He handled it as if it might dissolve in daylight. "This," Lucien said, unwrapping the layers, "is what they never translated." The book had no cover, no title. Its pages shimmered faintly with the oil of centuries, written not in Latin or Greek, but in a script Matteo had only seen once before, carved onto the side of that obsidian door. "The Gospel of the Deep," Lucien whispered, "mentioned in only one inventory. We believed it was a fake. Until now." Matteo turned the pages slowly. Every few lines, the ink shifted colour from rust red to copper, green to something almost silver. The pages smelled faintly of salt. At first, the writing was impossible to decipher, but as he gazed at the lines, meaning began to surface through the curves and hooks of the letters. It was not translation, not in the usual sense. It was memory, recognition. The first passage told of a voice beneath the water that once warned a priest not to construct on a ringed island. The second spoke of a city of light swallowed in fire. The third told of a covenant, a bargain between men and something older than men, something that had waited below the earth before even Adam had walked the garden. "The Vatican kept this?" Matteo asked softly. Lucien nodded. "And only 5 have ever opened it. One went insane. One disappeared near Gibraltar. The third became Pope Leo VI and never spoke of it again." Matteo looked at the ink again. The silver lines pulsed under the candlelight as if breathing. Lucien closed the book, gently returning the cloth. "The Church feared it. Not because it was false," he said, "but because it might be true." That night, Matteo dreamed of the ocean, not blue, but black. There were spires under the waves, a city with no name, bells ringing where no air could move. And somewhere in the silence, not a song, not a scream, but a prayer written not on paper, but into the ocean floor. A gospel no one had dared read aloud until now. That sentence echoed in Matteo's mind as he descended the marble steps beneath the Jesuit library, the Gospel of the Deep wrapped tightly beneath his arm. The candle in his hand cast shadows that twisted like roots along the damp stone walls. At the bottom of the stairwell a heavy door loomed, one he had passed 100 times without noticing. Tonight it stood slightly ajar, inside a narrow chamber stretched long and low. Along the walls were slabs of carved stone, each bearing ancient markings and small glass vials filled with murky water. At the far end sat a single chair carved from dark cedar, facing a basin carved from alabaster. This was not a room for ceremony. It was a method of verification, a test to see the truth of the currents. Matteo had only encountered mention of it in fractured pieces, vague clues hidden in texts the Church had outlawed, suggesting its former use to separate genuine revelation from delusion. The person being examined would take the sacred book in hand and read as the stone basin slowly filled with water. If the water stayed utterly still, the words were judged untrue. If a ripple appeared, the Church would be forced to reconsider its entire history. He sat down. The heavy book quivered slightly in his grasp, as if it held an ancient memory of its own. He started the reading. Nothing occurred at first. His voice called in the silence, returning to him, thin and brittle. The opening chapter detailed the first pact between humanity and the ocean, a bond preceding the Church, older than any scripture. The basin offered no movement. He turned the page, reciting the story of a sunken city, not destroyed by divine anger, but by its own sheer power of recollection. The water in the bowl stirred just a single, sharp time. Matteo paused, holding his breath, but went on reading. The next segment spoke of a certain priest who willingly entered the deep sea, never to return, yet whose sermons were later discovered preserved within a cave sealed on Crete. The water then began to intensely shimmer, coinciding exactly with him reading the description of this very trial, as if it spoke of his moment in the present. The basin shivered, and one lone drop lifted up, suspended in the air. Matteo stared, unable to even blink. It remained there, glowing with a soft internal light. A sound like a whisper followed, one not from any physical throat, but travelling through the damp stone as though the walls held a record of something the church had deliberately forgotten. The drop then merged back into the water, and everything returned to absolute stillness. Matteo carefully closed the book. His hands were no longer shaking. He understood now that the Vatican had not concealed the gospel from fear of heresy, but from a genuine terror of confirmation. What if Atlantis was not simply a legend, but a clear message, one waiting for this exact time to be voiced again? And what if the depths still listened for a sign? As he exited the chamber, the candle briefly flared and then died, but Matteo no longer needed the flame. The authentic truth was now fully awakened, and it would not be suppressed a second time. In the cold quiet of the early morning hours, as the bells of St. Peter's sounded like far-off thunder over the tiled roofs of Rome, Matteo walked quietly through the vast nave. The great basilica, which was typically filled with the low sounds of talking and moving feet, was completely empty. His boots met the polished marble floor without a single echo. He carried no scripture now, only the vivid memory of water that could recall history. He approached the main altar, the ornate canopy of the baldachin rising above him like a grand structure of abandoned hopes. Few people truly knew what lay beneath that spot. Fewer still had the nerve to venture down there. But Matteo now possessed the necessary token, the dark papyrus sheet pressed securely into his bag, the Gospel's revelation warming him like a freshly lit coal against his chest. And he had something else too, a single key, carefully carved from glass, hidden deep within the creases of the papyrus itself. The hidden entrance was located behind a thick marble panel, missed by both simple visitors and high-ranking cardinals. When he inserted the glass key into the slot, the panel made a soft click and slid inward, unveiling a tight, winding spiral staircase encased in complete silence. At its base was the solemn crypt of the veil. The air in the area was thick and heavy, carrying the lingering smell of sweet myrrh and old candle wax. Long, unlit stone coffins lined the inner walls, but Matteo walked past them without any interest. He was drawn instead to the small, plain altar at the very heart of the chamber, covered in a delicate layer of dust. Beneath it, contained by a boundary of dark obsidian tile, was the object of his journey, a smooth slab of reflective silver glass, polished and unbroken, like a mirror that showed nothing in its surface. He fell to his knees and intensely stared into it. He saw neither his own face nor the surrounding chamber, only emptiness. And then the change began. The mirrored surface went dark, moving like the shape of smoke captured in still water. Slowly, something definite began to take form. Not a face, not a simple picture, but an actual location. Rings, tall structures, long bridges meticulously carved from solid stone. A full city resting deep beneath the ocean, its sharp outlines still faintly glowing in the darkness. Atlantis, not a fantasy, but a place now remembered. Matteo extended his hand toward the surface. The mirror immediately grew noticeably warm beneath his palm, and in that very moment he witnessed not only the submerged city, but also the collective echoes of those who had once walked its stone corridors. They were more than myth. They were his ancestors. A subtle shadow shifted right beside him. He quickly turned his head. A priest dressed in flowing black robes stood directly behind him, his eyes impossible to read, his hands neatly clasped in front of him. He offered just a single remark. It only reveals itself to those who already carry belief within them. Matteo struggled to swallow, words entirely lost in his throat. He recognized this man, or at least knew of his existence, a phantom figure in the vast hallways of the Vatican, the perpetual guardian of the silver mirror. The priest moved closer and then closed the heavy panel without making a sound. "You must choose now," he whispered very softly, "whether to expose what this mirror remembers or commit yourself to protecting what it continues to hide." And the mirror's surface once again displayed nothing but silence. Matteo stood up, his knees aching, his hands still shaking from the vivid, fading image. The priest who had sealed the panel was completely gone. Not a single sound lingered in the crypt. No sound of feet, no shallow breathing, not even the soft echo of his own deep thoughts. He looked one last time at the polished glass lying beneath the altar, now appearing dull, completely lifeless, as though it had never been disturbed at all. But something fundamental had shifted deep inside him. A light now moved. Not the overwhelming fire of a sudden revelation, but a much gentler warmth, like the rising of dawn through a heavy mist. He laid a hand over his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart's beating. The mirror had not actually provided him with direct answers. It had clearly provided him with a destination. When he finally emerged from the subterranean chamber, the first rays of sunlight were just starting to pierce through the high windows of St. Peter's Basilica. The light struck the vast inner curve of the enormous dome, bathing the sacred space entirely in gold. And there, precisely where the bright light met the ceiling's fresco, he spotted it. A subtle, quick flash, like a single star had blinked once directly from the solid stone. He began to climb the winding stairwell toward the dome, moving far above the restricted areas for ordinary pilgrims, passing ancient statues and old metal scaffolding that was rarely touched. The higher he ascended, the more the light seemed to bend and flicker, actively dancing across the inner shell of the dome. Then he reached his goal, a particular patch of small mosaic tiles. Unlike the surrounding ones, these did not form a religious image, but a precise map, only visible when the morning sun passed through a narrow slit in the dome's outer structure. The Vatican's massive dome, built centuries earlier, had been engineered specifically to disclose something hidden not within its artistic elements but within its mathematical angles, geometry used as a form of scripture, light acting as a secret language. Matteo carefully traced the strange outline with his fingertips, slowly grasping the full reality of what he was seeing. This was not a map of the Earth as it currently exists. It was a map of the Earth as it had existed before the great floods, before the destructive cataclysms, before the full memory of Atlantis was buried beneath generations of myths. In the exact centre of the elaborate design, where all the drawn lines naturally came together, there was a small circular formation, an island, completely surrounded by multiple concentric rings, exactly as Plato had once described it. But this depiction showed it not in a state of decay or ruins, but fully alive, radiant and intact. He stepped back from the wall, his heart pounding hard. Could the church have truly hidden the final missing piece of the map right here in the dome for all this time? A secret placed high above to counterbalance the silence maintained below. Matteo had already witnessed many unusual things during his time working for the Vatican archives. But this was profoundly different. This felt like a direct personal invitation, and somewhere deep beneath his feet, far below the magnificent dome and the echoing chapels, the mirror remained completely silent. But the light had successfully returned, not just to the dome far above, but to a location that had been forgotten for too long. The archives, located beneath the Vatican Observatory, where dust had accumulated more thickly than any memory. It was to this spot that Matteo was drawn next, led more by raw instinct than by any planned direction, searching now not for a simple secret, but for the elusive man who had first successfully charted the light. His name had only been whispered a single time before, in a long corridor sealed off from most others. Father Aurelio di Castagna, a Jesuit, a brilliant cartographer, a solitary recluse, the last known person to have successfully translated a map not using common ink or a compass, but with deep meditative prayer. No one knew what ultimately became of him after the year 1927. He had been officially assigned to the South Atlantic Project, a strange Vatican-sponsored endeavour that sought to align astronomy, deep-sea oceanography, and ancient texts simultaneously. But immediately following his return, he seemed to vanish into a profound quiet. No published funeral, no brief obituary, no final church blessing. Yet Matteo now began to find small traces of his presence. A handwritten note in Latin, carefully tucked into a hollowed-out hymn book. A specific coordinate etched right onto the spine of a decoy book. A small sketch found underneath a greatly faded painting of the Virgin Mary where her hand reached not toward the heavens, but clearly pointed downward toward the sea. The deeper Matteo dug, the more compelling evidence he discovered, not in large, obvious gestures, but concealed within margins, simple lines, left in soft pencil. A delicate scrap of vellum parchment with an outline that bore absolutely no resemblance to Europe or Asia. It showed a location not defined by national boundaries, but by a certain rhythm. Spiral coastlines and radiating channels. A deep memory carefully disguised as geography. Father Aurelio had finally completed a hidden work. In a drawer that had been sealed shut behind a heavily warped cabinet on the very lowest floor of the observatory, Matteo found his prize. A scroll carefully bound in thick waxed cloth, not ancient but certainly old enough to carry the distinct scent of long past time. As he slowly unrolled it onto the wide oak table, a strange, absolute hush settled all around him. It was a map, yet not drawn to any known scale, and not a static image. A complex series of movements, different seasons, shifting points of light, the stars aligned precisely with coastlines, not as they exist today, but as they had once been. The specific date hastily scribbled in the corner was 8,200 years before Christ. The ink had surprisingly not faded at all. The intricate symbols remained absolutely clear. And in the lower left-hand corner, the cartographer's unique mark, Di Castagna, servant of the fifth circle. Matteo was frozen in his spot. Fifth circle? The peculiar term matched a detail he had found in the vaults, a highly restricted section within the Vatican's classification hierarchy, used only one other time. It had been used to restrict a single document, a document that described the precise origin of the flood myth and the downfall of a place that was simply not meant to be remembered. Aurelio had done more than just sketch Atlantis. He had meticulously mapped the church's own path back to its location, and someone powerful had kept that truth deeply buried. Until this moment. But why? Why would a devoted Jesuit priest spend decades on a silent, secret map leading not just to some mythical island, but to something much deeper, much more profound and strange? Something the Vatican had nearly erased completely from its collective memory? Matteo slowly leaned back from the scroll, its delicate edges still gently curling toward the single candle light. The quiet hum of the massive archive room returned, but he could no longer hear its sound. He could only hear Aurelio's long silence, a silence that was so complete it felt like a scream. Then he saw it, just above the cartographer's carefully placed mark. A single brief phrase, half faded and written not in Latin but in Greek. To truly locate the soul, one must track where it once drowned. It was not a map intended to find land. It was a precise map to the soul itself. Atlantis had always been recounted as a dark story of human pride and divine punishment, a magnificent city swallowed by the merciless sea for its overbearing arrogance. But what if that was only a fraction of the full story? What if the tragic fall of Atlantis was not the final end of a people, but instead the hidden beginning of something buried deep within the core of every single person, a permanent break between the celestial heavens and the human heart? Matteo now began randomly pulling books from the shelves. Ancient texts on obscure mysticism, completely forgotten theology, myths from before the flood woven into obscure Christian practices. A distinct pattern slowly emerged. Writings from the very early Desert Fathers hinted at a time before the Tower of Babel, when language was not fragmented but beautifully sung. A pure music of the soul that allowed men and women to directly communicate with the divine source. Atlantis, according to one specific Syrian scroll, had been the final location where that original music still existed. The sea had not merely claimed a city, it had tragically taken something far greater. The memory of essential connection, the pure song of truth. And somewhere the Vatican had possessed this secret, not as the triumphant conquerors of truth, but as its terrified, desperate guardians. Aurelio's complex map did not merely point to a specific island. It clearly pointed to the exact location where that original music last ascended, to the very wound in the spirit of the world, and perhaps, eventually, to its healing. But if all of that were absolutely true, then why was it kept so fiercely hidden? Matteo's thoughts began to spiral. Was the truth too intrinsically dangerous? Would the act of reawakening the ancient harmony fundamentally tear apart the newer order of things? Had the Church feared not the destruction of Atlantis, but the terrifying possibility of its ultimate return? He sat in the dim light, his hand now severely trembling. Above the unrolled scroll, he thought of the sacred vow he had taken. To always protect the truth, yes, but also to relentlessly seek it out, even if that meant having to wander completely alone through endless shadows. Beneath the thick waxed cloth, a much smaller secondary map was found sewn directly to the back, one that showed no coastlines or constellations, but instead showed organs, nerves, and human bones. A detailed map of the entire human body, but the heart was clearly not located where it should have been. It was marked off-centre, slightly beneath the ribs, as if the soul itself remembered a location the physical body had long forgotten. Matteo instinctively pressed his palm hard against his own chest, as if attempting to physically feel for that misplaced heart. The scroll trembled noticeably in his other hand. He could still hear the low hush of the candle's steady flame, but it sounded like something else entirely, now. Like soft waves gently brushing up against massive stone. The idea came very slowly, like a thick fog rolling in over the Tiber River. What if the sea was never intended to be an external entity? What if it was always meant to be internally carried, a profound memory not of mere water but of essential origin and devastating loss? He stood up and left the archives, scroll clutched tightly in hand, moving through the expansive Vatican halls, like a man walking inside a profound dream. It was now nearing midnight, but the uniformed guards did not even attempt to stop him. His steps led him, almost against his will, to one of the most ancient chapels, completely hidden behind layers of modern reconstruction, utterly forgotten by the passage of time, yet inexplicably always left fully standing. No one ever spoke of the chapel by its original name. It was simply known as the Sealed One, forever locked and undisturbed, except that tonight it was slightly ajar. A quiet, cool draught stirred the air from inside the opening. Matteo slowly stepped into the space. The chamber was perfectly round, not grand and enormous like St. Peter's Basilica, but intimate, like standing deep inside the very core of something truly alive. The floor was made of polished marble, but deeply darkened by the centuries. In the precise centre sat an altar made of grey stone, completely unadorned save for a single, simple engraving. 3 clear, concentric rings, and at the absolute centre a single drop, carved in deep relief. He moved closer and immediately noticed something he could not easily rationalise. The heavy marble floor directly beneath his feet felt distinctly damp. He touched it. It was completely dry. But then, as he took another step forward, the sound returned, that exact low hush of moving waves. He stood directly over the altar. Then he distinctly heard it. Not just the sound of water, a human voice, faint and completely without rhythm, as if it was slowly rising from far deep beneath the earth. Not in Latin, not in any language he had ever previously encountered. Yet somehow he instantly understood the meaning, a call or perhaps a direct question. The sea, the voice whispered, has never actually been lost. It was purposefully placed here, deep inside, beneath thick stone, beneath countless layers of forgotten memory. Matteo's breath hitched hard in his chest. The altar was not just a symbolic representation. It was the heavy lid of something else. He slowly circled the structure, and there, almost hidden in the worn seams of the surrounding floor, he saw a faint circular alignment. A hatch. He immediately dropped to his knees, his searching fingers feeling for any kind of release mechanism. There was none, no apparent mechanical lock. But when he simply touched the centre, that single carved drop, a distinct click echoed throughout the chamber, and the surrounding marble floor began to profoundly breathe. It rose and then fell as though the ancient stone itself remembered having lungs it never actually possessed. Matteo quickly stepped backward, his heart now pounding not with any fear but with a profound awe. A low, persistent hum filled the entire room, vibrating deep within his bones like a fundamental memory desperately attempting to return. Then the hatch in the floor slowly parted, its seams now wide enough to clearly reveal a spiral staircase carved from completely black stone, winding steeply downward into absolute darkness. He hesitated for just a single moment, then began his descent. Each successive step brought a deeper, more cutting chill, as though he were walking not just into the Earth's core, but into a specific moment of forgotten time. The cold, ancient walls were dripping with condensation. The overwhelming smell was of ancient salt and damp stone and complete silence. After exactly 29 steps, he emerged into a narrow, dim corridor lit only by small, quiet orbs of blue light embedded directly in the ceiling like tiny, sleeping stars. He passed through a large arch carved with words he could only just make out. That which the flood forcefully buried, the soul shall patiently lift. At the very end of the passage stood a single, enormous door, heavy and grandly arched, its entire frame carved with entirely unfamiliar symbols, and at its centre a strange crest, the official seal of a cardinal. But not just any cardinal, Cardinal Ventresca. Matteo remembered the name only because of a single ancient letter one passed secretly hand to hand through the entire Jesuit order until it finally reached the archives. The cardinal had completely disappeared in the year 1922, immediately following a brief private audience with Pope Pius. No one had ever spoken of him again, not even in the lowest whispers. Matteo slowly opened the heavy door. Inside was a small, dry chamber, entirely lined with walls of black obsidian glass. In the precise middle sat a single, simple chair and a table. Upon it lay an old tape recorder covered in thick dust and a single frail slip of paper. The recorder immediately clicked on the moment his hand brushed against it. The voice that emerged was clearly weathered, yet remarkably calm and impossibly clear. "This is Cardinal Ventresca." If you are hearing this message, then the sea has finally begun to speak. Again. Matteo leaned in closer to the speaker. There are still places beneath this immense city, the calm voice continued, older than Rome itself, older even than the myth of Babel. They are not mere ruins. They are not simply abstract metaphors. They are fundamentally alive. We incorrectly mistook the Great Flood for a punishment. But in truth, it was a long preparation. There was a prolonged pause, then a soft sigh. And so I'm left to leave you with only one final question, Ventresca said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. If the essence of a soul can reside where flesh cannot follow, where does the true sanctuary stand? A profound stillness followed. Matteo watched the recording device, the query repeating in his consciousness like tides on a hidden coastline. The atmosphere within the space appeared to compress, as if reacting to the weight of the cardinal's last utterance. And beneath that silence, a subtle sound emerged from the dark stone floor. He thought he detected a faint movement. Matteo held his breath, straining to hear. It was not a current of air. It was not the grinding of the foundation. It was a hushed sound, yet not in any recognizable voice or dialect. It circled around him, drifting like mist over the floor's surface. Then, abruptly, the wall at the back of the vault pivoted inward with a low moan like a strained pipe organ. Fine dust rained down from above, as if dislodged by the sheer passage of time. He moved into the adjoining chamber. Here, no light source was visible, yet somehow his vision remained. The surrounding walls were sleek, dark like polished obsidian, and at the core of the space rested a simple stand. Upon it rested a volume. It dwarfed any Bible he had encountered, its covering material not leather, but something translucent, resembling compressed embers. No identifying script marked its front, no holy symbol, only one glyph. 3 circles nested one inside the next, crossed by a single straight line. His fingers trembled as he drew it open. The pages felt thick and brittle like dried flower petals. The script was impossibly detailed, but it shifted with every page he turned. The writing seemed to instantaneously reform itself. Languages appeared only to vanish. Latin, ancient Greek, Aramaic, and languages he could not name. The characters were animated, breathing, constantly reforming. Then, on the final leaf, there was nothing. No letters, just a dividing line, and below it, an instruction. This leaf awaits your hand. Matteo paused, considering this. It was not phrased as an order or a prophecy. It was stated as an undeniable reality. A sensation began to expand within his chest. It was not dread. It was the realization that this volume was not intended to be deciphered. It was meant to be completed. He stepped back quickly, his heart racing. But, as he did, the surface beneath his feet began a gentle vibration, like the slow, ancient heartbeat of something just rousing. The air again grew dense and the whisper returned, closer now, not external, but internal. He tried to force the book shut, but it resisted. He attempted to exit the chamber, but the doorway behind him had dissolved. It was not a confinement, it was a summons. Matteo grasped then what the church had concealed, not merely a geographical point, not just the myth of Atlantis, but the very concept that history is not inert. It has vitality. It records. And sometimes it remains until someone arrives, not for the purpose of finding it, but for the purpose of becoming its continuation. The page facing him had a soft luminescence. And then, without conscious thought, he reached for the writing instrument that had not been there moments before. It was neither metal nor wood, but smooth and cool, like a river-worn pebble. Matteo held it gingerly, its weight oddly familiar, as if it had always been meant for his grip. The blank page of the book now emitted a soft glow, pulsing in synchronization with something hidden deep beneath the floor. He guided the pen to the paper, but no ink flowed. Instead, the instant the point met the surface, the room around him began to blur and the stone walls dissolved into a hazy vapour. The stand crumbled like desiccated salt. Matteo did not fall. He drifted, as if the entire room had been a recollection being erased in real time. Then, with a sudden quiet that was louder than any blast, he found himself in another location entirely. The earth was stone, aged and fractured yet warm to his touch. Above, a sky of swirling violet stretched out. Encircling him stood a ring of columns, each one inscribed with scripts older than religious texts, older than any tale. And at the centre a stone. It was no bigger than a loaf of bread, yet it vibrated with a deep, steady rhythm, like a distant drum buried at the core of the world. The stillness of the stones was not an absence of noise. It was the burden of vast knowledge, of safeguarding truth for too long. Matteo approached carefully. He now perceived that the carvings etched into the stone were not merely writing. They were schematics of lost cities, oceans never navigated, and a single island drawn and redrawn as if striving to accurately recall itself. Atlantis, not as a fable but as a living memory. He laid his hand upon the stone. The world seemed to lurch. Voices, hundreds, thousands, surged into him, not chaotically, but in perfect accord. They spoke of a metropolis consumed not by the ocean but by profound silence, of a faith constructed on deliberate oblivion, of promises that distorted reality for the sake of protection, and of a solitary individual selected not to discover the island, but to remind humanity that it had never truly disappeared. Matteo stumbled backward. The writing instrument was in his hand once more, the book open before him, the final page still blank. And this time he penned the page, he surrendered to it. With every stroke, the chamber surrounding him materialized again, not as he had seen it, but as it had originally been. A sacred space of rock and illumination, created not to conceal information, but to safeguard it. When his writing ceased, the pen vanished and the book sealed itself. He raised his eyes. The quiet remained. But it had changed. It was no longer empty. It was resonant, filled with the sounds of earth, of water, of continuous time, brimming with the history that had finally been given permission to speak. Matteo placed his palm upon the cover of the book, breathed a silent prayer he did not know he possessed, and turned toward the light filtering down from above. The stones had delivered their message, and this time someone had truly listened. Thank you for watching, remaining with us until the very end. If any element of this narration caused you to pause, to question, or to sense the proximity of something ancient, let us know in the comments below. We are eager to hear what resonated with you, and if you have not yet, make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss a hidden story waiting to be told. Continue to seek knowledge, and until our next encounter, keep listening for the subtle sounds history attempted to conceal.